Chapter 2. The Election War. Some people are saying the FSV is behind the bombings. My editor, one of the smartest people I knew, said to me when I walked in one afternoon in September 1999. Do you believe it? For 3 weeks, Moscow and other Russian cities had been terrorized by a series of explosions. The first occurred on August 31st in a crowded shopping mall in the center of Moscow. One person died and more than 30 people were injured. But it was not immediately clear that this explosion was anything more frightening than a giant prank or perhaps a shot fired in a business dispute. 5 days later, an explosion brought down a large part of apartment block in the southern city of Bayansk, not far from Chechnya. 64 people were killed and 146 injured, but all of the building's residents were Russian military officers and their families, so although the dead includes 23 children, the blast did not have the effect of making civilians, especially civilians living in Moscow, feel vulnerable and scared. 4 days later, however, at 2 seconds before midnight on September 8, a giant blast sounded in a bedroom neighborhood outside Moscow's city center. A densely populated concrete city block was ripped in half. 2 of its stair walls, 72 apartments in total, completely obliterated. Exactly 100 people died. Nearly 700 more were injured. 5 days later, another explosion brought down another building on the outskirts of Moscow. The 88-story brick building folded in on itself like a house of cards. The journalist in the crowd that rushed to the building that morning talked about the fact that concrete buildings apparently explode outward, while brick ones collapse inward. The blast came at 5 in the morning, which meant that most residents were home at the time. Almost all of them were killed. 124 people were dead and 7 injured. 3 days after that, on September 16, a truck blew up in the street in Volgodonsk, a city in southern Russia. 19 people died and over 1,000 were injured. Panic set in all over the country. Residents of Moscow and other Russian cities formed neighborhood patrols. Many people went out into the streets simply because it felt safer than sleeping in their apartments. Volunteers stopped anyone they considered suspicious, which often meant everyone who was not a part of the patrol. At least one group of Moscow volunteers stopped everyone walking a dog to check the dog. The police all over the country were inundated with calls from people who thought they had been a suspicious activity or suspicious objects. On September 22, police responding to call in Ryazan, a city about 100 miles from Moscow, found 3 bags of explosives planted under the stairway. Of an apartment building. In a country stricken with fear and grief, no one doubted that the Chechens had done it, and I was not an exception. I had spent the previous couple of days driving around Moscow visiting Chechen families, refugees, professionals who had settled there long ago, temporary workers living in dormitories. All of them were terrified. Police in Moscow were rounding up young Chechen men, detaining hundreds of them in connection with the bombings. Many of the men I interviewed not only stopped going outside but refused even to open their apartment or dormitory room doors. One family's child had come home from school saying the teacher had written the Russian words for explosion and Chechen side by side on the chalkboard. I knew the police were detaining hundreds of innocent men, but I could easily imagine that whoever was guilty was a Chechen or a group of people who came from Chechnya. I had covered the 1994-96 war in Chechnya from beginning to end. The first time in the stairway of an apartment building for the blind on the outskirts of Grozny, the Chechen capital. It was January 1995, the first month of the war, and I had gone to that particular quarter of the city because the Russian army claimed it was not bombing civilians. I could imagine no one who fit the very definition of civilian better than the residents of that building. Blind, helpless, unable to leave the city. When I stepped outside the building, I saw bodies and body parts strewn around. The many children I saw on the streets of Grozny on that day and on subsequent day had seen the same thing. They were the children who would be hanging around the open fires on Grozny's sidewalks in the coming weeks, watching their mothers prepare food. These were the same children who would then spend years cooped up in tiny apartments, packed half a dozen to a room, because so many of the buildings had been bombed out of existence, and forbidden to go outside for fear of hitting a landmine or a Russian soldier who might rape a girl or detain a boy. And still, they went outside and were raped, detained, tortured, disappeared, or saw it happen to their sisters, brothers, and friends. These children were young adults now, and I had no trouble believing some of them would be capable of horrific revenge. Most Russians had not seen what I had seen, but they saw television footage of the explosion sites, each one more terrifying than the last. The war in Chechnya had never really ended. The arrangement brokered 3 years earlier by Berezovsky, among others, amounted to a ceasefire. Russians were very much a nation at war, and like all nations at war, they believed the enemy to be both less than human and capable of inflicting unimaginable horror. On September 23, a group of 24 governors, more than a quarter of all governors in Federation, wrote a letter to President Yeltsin asking him to yield power to Putin, who had been in office as Prime Minister for just over a month. The same day, Yeltsin issued a secret decree authorizing the army to resume combat in Chechnya. The decree was also illegal because Russian law forbids the use of regular troops within the country's border. That day, Russian military planes once again began bombing Grozny, starting with the airport, the oil refinery, and residential neighborhoods. The following day, Putin issued his own order authorizing Russian troops to engage in combat in Chechnya. This time, the order was not classified, though Russian law in fact gives the Prime Minister no authority over the military. The same day, Putin made one of his first television appearances. "We will hunt them down," he said of the terrorists. "Whenever we find them, we will destroy them. Even if we find them in the toilet, we will rub them out in the outhouse." Putin was using rhetoric markedly different from Yeltsin. He was not promising to bring the terrorists to justice, nor was he expressing compassion for the hundreds of victims of the explosion. This was the language of a leader who was planning to rule with his fist. These sorts of vulgar statements, often spiced with below-the-belt humor, would become Putin's signature oratorical device. His popularity began to soar. Berezovsky, the PhD, and his small propaganda army, formed of highly educated men, seemed to see no contradiction between their stated goal of securing Russia's democratic future and the man in whom they had chosen to rest their hopes for this future. They worked tirelessly on their campaign, using the might of Berezovsky's channel, one to smear former Prime Minister Primakov and his governor allies. One memorable program explained Primakov's recent hip surgery in repulsive anatomical detail. Another focused on Moscow's mayor Yuri Ruzhkov's ostensible resemblance to Mussolini. But in addition to discrediting his opponents, Putin's allies, who thought of themselves more as his authors than his supporters, had to create and put forth an image of their own candidate. Strictly speaking, Putin was not running a campaign. The presidential election was not expected for nearly a year, and Russia did not have a political culture of protracted campaigns. But the people who wanted to see him become president were very much campaigning. An influential political consulting firm called the Foundation for Effective Politics, located in one of the city's most beautiful historic buildings just across the river from the Kremlin, was tasked with creating the image of Putin as a young, energetic politician who would advance much needed reform. Everyone was tired of Elsin. It was an easy job to do. A woman who had been instrumental in the campaign told me. Her name was Marina Litvinovich, and like many people who worked at the Foundation for Effective Politics, she was very young, very smart. She had just graduated from one of the best universities and very inexperienced in politics, even naive. She had come to work at the foundation part-time when she was still a student, and 3 years later she was a key person on the presidential campaign team. She believed herself to be entirely devoted to democratic ideals, and yet she saw nothing wrong with the way the future president was being invented and sold to the public. She simply trusted the people who had thought the whole thing up. There were some articles coming out saying he was from the KGB, she told me years later. But the headquarters was staffed with liberals, and we were convinced these were the people who would make up his inner circle. Nor did one have to be young and naive to believe that. In the late summer of 1999, I had a memorable dinner with Alexander Goldfarb, an old acquaintance who had been a dissident in the 1970s. He had played the role of Andrei Sakharov's translator, become an emigre, spending the 1980s in New York, and turned into a highly effective social activist in 1990s. He had served as billionaire philanthropist George Soros' advisor on Russia. He had then launched a campaign to publicize and fight Russia's epidemic of drug-resistant tuberculosis, bringing it to the world's attention almost single-handedly. Now Alex and I were having dinner and talking about Putin. He is the KGB's flesh and blood, I said to him. Then still testing a theory more than making an argument, but I hear from Chuveis that he is smart, effective and worldly. Alex countered. Even a former dissident was nearly convinced that Putin was the modern young politician the Foundation for Effective Politics was inventing. The more the military campaign in Chechnya escalated, the more the entire country seemed to be in thrall. Berezovsky, meanwhile, came up with the idea of a new political party, one that would be entirely devoid of ideology. Nobody would hear the words if we said them. He told me 9 years later, still apparently convinced this had been a stellar invention. I decided we would replace ideology with faces. Berezovsky people cast about for faces and came up with a couple of celebrities and one cabinet minister. But the face that mattered most belonged to the man who had been faceless just weeks earlier. As Putin's popularity soared, so did the new political parties. In the parliamentary election on December 1999, nearly a quarter of the voters chose the 2-month-old bloc called Edin Stop Unity or Medved the Bear, making it the largest faction in the lower house of parliament. The cement Putin's raid. Someone in the family, no one seems able to recall who it was any longer, proposed a brilliant move. Elsin should resign early as prime minister. Putin would by law become acting president, turning into an instant incumbent in the upcoming race. His opponents would be caught by surprise and the lead time to the election would be shortened. In fact, Elsin should do it on December 31st. It would be a very Elsin move. He would upstage the millennium, the Y2K bug, and any other news story that might occur almost any place in the world. It would also come on the eve of traditional 2-week New Year's and Christmas hiatus, making the time available for Putin's opponent to prepare for the vote that much shorter. New Year's, a secular holiday, and had long since superseded all other occasions as Russia's biggest family holiday. On this night, Russians everywhere would gather with friends and family just before the end of the year. They would assemble in front of their television sets to watch the clock on one of the Kremlin towers strike midnight, to raise their glasses of champagne, and only then to sit down to a traditional meal. In the minutes leading up to midnight, the nation's leader would give a speech. This had been a tradition in the Soviet Union, and it had been picked up by Boris Yeltsin on December 31st, 1992. On December 31st, 1991, as the Soviet Union officially ended its existence, the nation was addressed by a comedian. Yeltsin appeared on television 12 hours ahead of schedule. "My friends," he said, "my dear, today is the last time I am going to address you on New Year's Eve. But that is not all. Today is the last time I address you as the President of Russia. I have made a decision. I spent a long and difficult time thinking about it. Today, on the last day of the century, I am going to resign. I am leaving. Russia should enter the new millennium with new politicians, new faces, new smart, strong, energetic people. Why should I hold on to my seat for 6 more months when the country has a strong person who deserves to become president and to whom virtually every Russian has linked his hopes for the future?" Then Yeltsin apologized. "I am sorry," he said, "that many of our dreams failed to come true. That things we thought would be easy turned out to be painfully hard. I am sorry that I did not live up to the hopes of people who believed that we could, with a single effort, a single strong push, jump out of our grey, stagnant, totalitarian past and into a bright, wealthy, civilized future. I used to believe that myself. I have never said this before, but I want you to know. I felt the pain of each of you in my heart. I spent sleepless nights, painful periods, thinking about what I could do to make life just a little bit better. I am leaving. I have done all I could. A new generation is coming. They can do more and better." Yeltsin spoke for 10 minutes. He looked bloated, heavy, barely mobile. He also looked dejected, helpless, like a man who was burying himself alive in plain view of over 100 million people. His facial expression barely changed throughout the speech, but his voice cracked with emotions as he signed off. At midnight, it was Vladimir Putin who appeared on television. He looked noticeably nervous at first, and even stuttered at the beginning of his speech, but seemed more confident as he went on. He spoke for 3.5 minutes. Remarkably, he did not seem to use the opportunity to give his first stump speech. He made no promises and said nothing that could be interpreted as being inspiring. He said instead that nothing would change in Russia and assured viewers that their rights were well protected. In closing, he proposed Russians raise a glass to Russia's new century, though he had no glass of his own to raise. Putin was now acting president, and the election campaign was officially underway. Putin recalled Berezovsky was disciplined and even docile. He did as he was told, and he was told not to do much. He was already so popular that this was in a sense a non-campaign campaign. Leading up to non-election election, all Putin had to do was never seem too different from whatever it was voters wished to see in him. On January 26, 2000, exactly 2 months before the election, the moderator of a Russia panel at the annual World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland, asked, "Who is Mr. Putin?" Choice, the man who had 7 months earlier argued that Putin would make an ideal successor, was holding the microphone when the question sounded. He fidgeted and looked questioningly at a former Russian Prime Minister sitting to his right. The former minister, too, was clearly unwilling to respond. The panel's 4 members started looking back and forth at each other annexiously. After half a minute of this, the room exploded in laughter. Two world's largest landmass, a land of oil, gas and nuclear arms, had a new leader, and its business and political allies had no idea who he was. Very funny indeed. 1 week later, Berezovsky commissioned 3 journalists from a newspaper he owned to write Putin's life story. One of them was a young blonde who had spent a couple of years in the Kremlin pool but had managed to remain unnoticed next to more colorful colleagues. Another was a young reporter who had won acclaim for his humorous reports but had never written about politics. The third member of the team was a star, a veteran political reporter who had spent the early 80s covering wars all over the world and the late 80s writing about politics and especially about the KGB for Moscow News, Perestroika's flagship publication. Natalia Givorkian was a reporter, the undisputed leader of the team, and the journalist Berezovsky knew best. Berezovsky would keep calling me and asking, "Isn't he fucking amazing?" She told me years later, I would say, "Boya, your problem is you have never done a KGB colonel. He is not fucking amazing. He is perfectly ordinary." I was curious, of course, to know who this guy was, who was now going to run the country. She told me, so I got the sense he liked to talk and he liked to talk about himself. I have certainly spoken to many people who were more interesting. I had spent 5 years writing about the KGB. He was no better or worse than the rest of them. He was smarter than some and more cunning than some. In addition to the forbidding task of putting together a book, in a matter of days, Natalia Givorkian wanted to use her time with the acting president to help a friend, Andrei Babitsky, a reporter for the US-funded Radio Free Europe or Radio Liberty, had disappeared in Chechnya in January. He had apparently been detained by Russian troops for violating their strict embedding policy. During the first war in Chechnya, the media had been sharply and consistently critical of Moscow's action. So this time around, the military banned journalists from traveling in the war zone, unaccompanied by uniformed personnel. This policy not only hindered access to combatants on both sides, but exposed journalists to danger. It is almost always safer in a war zone not to have a uniform on you or near you. The more enterprising reporters tried to circumvent the policy, and few were better at this than Babitsky, who had for years been reporting specifically on the North Caucasus. For 2 weeks following his detention, Babitsky's family and friends heard nothing from him. Rumors soon spread in Moscow's journalist circle, however, that Babitsky had been seen in the infamous Russian prison of Chernokozovo in Chechnya. On February 3, the day after Givorkian and her colleagues began interviewing Putin for his biography, Russian officials announced that Babitsky had been exchanged for 3 Russian soldiers who had been held captive by Chechen combatants. The Russian officials claimed Babitsky had consented to the exchange, but this could hardly conceal the fact that Russian troops had treated a Russian journalist, as an enemy combatant. When Givorkian asked Putin about Babitsky, her question elicited what she later described as undisguised hatred. The acting president's flattened affect momentarily broke, and he launched into a diatribe. He was working directly for the enemy. He was not a neutral source of information. He worked for the outlaws. So when the viewers said, "We are willing to free a few of your soldiers in exchange for this correspondent," our pupil asked him, "Do you want to be exchanged?" He said, "I do." He does. These were our soldiers. They were fighting for Russia. If we had not taken them back, they would have been executed, and they are not going to do anything to Babitsky there because he is one of them. What Babitsky did is much more dangerous than firing a machine gun. He had a map of getting around our checkpoints, who asked him to stick his nose in there if he was not authorized by the official authorities. So he was arrested and he became the object of an investigation. And he says, I don't trust you. I trust the Chechens. If they want to take me, you should give me to them. He got a response, then go, get out of here. So you say he is Russian citizen. Then he should have acted in accordance with the laws of your country if you want to be protected by these laws. Listening to this monologue, Zhivolkian grew convinced that the acting president had direct knowledge of Babitsky's case. So she decided to be direct too. He's got a family, he has children. She said to Putin, you have to stop this operation. The head of state took the bait. There will be a car arriving soon, he said. It will deliver a cassette tape and you will see that he is alive and well. Zhivolkian, who had maintained decorum throughout her many meetings with Putin, was momentarily shocked into rudeness. Hello. She almost screamed. You handed him over to the outlaws. Is this what they told you? She excused herself to step outside the room to call a friend at Radio Liberty's Moscow bureau. Tell his wife he is alive, she said. How do you know? Asked the friend. From the horse's mouth. Zhivolkian responded. Do you trust him? The friend asked. Not really, Zhivolkian admitted. But a few hours later, the friend called her back. You are not going to believe this, she said. A car came, its license plate so dirty, we could not make out of the numbers. They offered to sell us a video cassette tape and we paid few $100 for it. The video, which Radio Liberty immediately released to all media, was a grainy recording of Babitsky, looking pale, exhausted and sleep-deprived, saying, this is February 6, 2000, I am relatively all right. My only problem is time, since circumstances are stacking up in such a way that unfortunately I cannot make it home right away. Here my life is as normal as it can be in conditions of war. People who are near me try to help me in some way. The only problem is I would really like to go home. I would really like all of this to end finally. Please don't worry about me. I hope to be home soon. In fact, Babitsky was being held under lock and key in a residential house in a Chechen village. He was indeed sleep-deprived, exhausted, and most of all terrified. He did not know who was holding him prisoner. He knew only that they were armed Chechen men who had every reason to hate Russians and no clear reason to trust him. He was unable to sleep, fearing as he went to bed every night that he would be awakened to be taken to his execution, and he greeted every morning, hating himself for not yet having devised a way to escape or gathered the courage to attempt to break free. Finally, on February 23, he was placed in the trunk of a car, driven to the neighboring Republic of Dagestan, given crudely forged documents and released there, only to be arrested a few hours later by Russian police, who transported him to Moscow, where he would face charges of forgery for the documents he was carrying. It soon emerged that there had probably been no exchange. There was no documented trace of it. All of the soldiers who had supposedly been handed over by the Chechens. Babitsky's arrest, his television televised handover to the enemy, and subsequent disappearance had all, it seems, been an effort to send a message to journalists. Defense Minister Igor Sergeyev told the media as much. Babitsky had been singled out, he said, because the information he transmitted was not objective. To put it mildly, he added, I would happily have given 10 Babitskys for a single soldier. Putin had been in office for 1 month and already ministers were talking just like him. Just as, it seemed, they had been longing to talk for a while. What Putin apparently did not expect was that what he viewed as meting out perfectly fair punishment would inspire outrage internationally. During his first month as acting president, Western leaders had acted much like the Russian people. They seemed so relieved that predictable, embarrassing Elsin was gone, that they were willing to project their sweetest dreams onto Putin. The Americans and the British acted as though the outcome of the March election were a foregone conclusion, but now the Americans had no choice but to react. Babetsky was not simply a Russian journalist. He was a Russian journalist employed by a media outlet funded by an act of Congress. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright raised the issue in meeting with Russian Foreign Minister Igor Ivanov on February 4, and 5 days later the State Department issued a statement condemning the treatment of a non-combatant as a hostage or prisoner of war. The unexpected scrutiny and courage probably saved Babetsky's life. They also made Putin bitter and angry. He knew that what he was doing was just that. A man like Babetsky, someone who seemed not at all concerned about the Russian war effort and not at all ashamed to feel compassion for the enemy, did not deserve to live, or at least to live among Russian citizens. A conspiracy of bleeding hurt Democrats had forced Putin to compromise. He had successfully beaten these kinds of people back in Leningrad, and he would do it again now. The Babetsky story made my life easier. Gevorkian later told me, I realized that this was how Putin was going to rule, that this is how his fucking brain works. So I had no illusions. I knew this was how he understood the word patriotism, just the way he had been taught in all those KGB schools. The country is as great as the fear it inspires, and the media should be loyal. Soon after this discovery, Gevorkian left Moscow for Paris, where she still lives. Andrew Babetsky, as soon as he was able, left for Prague, where he continued to work for Radio Liberty. But in the year 2000, in the days leading up to the election, Gevorkian said nothing publicly. Putin's biography was published as he wanted it. Even the impassioned and telling passage about Babetsky was cut, though it had made it into an advanced newspaper excerpt. With few exceptions, Russians were ready to persist in placing their faith in Putin. On March 24, 2 days before the presidential election, NTV, the television network founded and owned by Vladimir Guzinsky, the same oligarch who owned the magazine where I worked, aired an hour-long program in talk show format before a live audience devoted to the incident in the city of Ryazan. The previous September, when police responding to a call had found 3 bags of explosives under the stairway of an apartment building. Vigilant residents thought they had managed to foil a terrorist plan. Just after 9 then that evening, September 22, Alexei Kartofelnikov, a bus driver for the local social team, was returning home to a 12-story brick apartment building at 14 Novosibirsk Street. He saw a Russian-made car pull up to the building. A man and a woman got out and went in through a door leading to the cellar, while the driver and other men stayed in the car. Kartofelnikov watched the man and woman emerge a few minutes later. Then the car pulled right up to the cellar door, and all 3 unloaded heavy-looking sacks and carried them into the cellar. They all then returned to the car and left. But by this time, 4 buildings had been blown up in Moscow and 2 other cities. In at least one case, eyewitness later emerged saying they had seen sacks planted in a stairway. So it is not surprising that Kartofelnikov tried to take down the license plate number of the car, but the part of the license plate signifying the region where the car was registered was covered with a piece of paper that had the number that stood for Ryazan on it. Kartofelnikov called the police. The police arrived nearly 45 minutes later. 2 officers entered the cellar, where they found 3 50-kilogram sacks marked sugar stacked on one atop another. Through a slit in the top sack, they could see wires and a clock. They ran out of the cellar to call for reinforcement and began evacuating residents from the 77 apartments in the building while the bomb squad was on its way. They bombed the building, knocking on all doors and ordering residents to exit immediately. People came outside in their pajamas, nightgowns and bathrobes, not pausing to lock their door. After weeks of watching news reports of apartment building explosions, everyone took the threat seriously. Several disabled people were wheeled outside in their wheelchairs, but several severely disabled people stayed inside their apartments, terrified. The rest of the residents would spend most of the night standing in the chilling wind outside their building. After a time, the manager of a nearby movie theater invited the residents to come in and even organized hot tea for them. In the morning, many of the residents went to work, though the police did not allow them to enter the building to wash up or get a change of clothes. At some point, many of the apartments were looted. Even before all the residents had made it outside, the bomb squad had disabled the timer and analyzed the contents of the sacks. They concluded it was hexogen, a powerful explosive in use since World War II. In English-speaking countries, it is more commonly known as RTX. It was also the substance used in at least one of the Moscow explosions, so the entire country had learned the word hexogen from an announcement made by the mayor of Moscow. The crudely made detonation mechanism contained a clock set for 5:30 in the morning. The terrorist plan was apparently exactly the same as in the Moscow explosion. The amount of explosive would have destroyed the building entirely and possibly damaged nearby structures, killing all residents in their sleep. After the bomb squad concluded that the sacks contained explosives, the city's uniformed brass rushed to 14 Novosibirsk Street, the street of the local branch of the FSB, addressed the residents, congratulating them on being born again. Alexei Kartofelnikov, the driver who had phoned in the suspicious people with their sacks, became an instant hero. Local officials praised him and the vigilance of the ordinary people in general. The more alert we are, the better we can fight the evil that has taken up residence in our country, the first deputy governor told news agencies. The following day, all of Russia talked only of Ryazan, in the terrifying reality in which Russians had been living for nearly a month. This seemed like the first bit of relatively good news. If the people mobilized, if they marched out for themselves, it seemed to say they might be able to save themselves. Not only that, the terrorist might actually be caught. The police knew the make and color of car, and Kartofelnikov had seen the people who unloaded the sacks. On September 24, Interior Minister Vladimir Roussello, looking gaunt and haunted, spoke at an interagency meeting devoted to the series of explosions. There have been some positive developments, said Roussello. For example, the fact that an explosion was prevented in Ryazan yesterday. But half an hour later, something entirely unexpected and perfectly inexplicable happened. The head of the FSB, Nikolai Patrushev, a former Leningrad hand whom Putin had brought in as his deputy at the secret police and then chose to replace himself when he became prime minister, spoke to reporters in the same building where the interagency meeting was taking place and said that Roussello was wrong. First, there was no explosion, he said. Second, nothing was prevented. And I don't think it was very well done. It was a training exercise and the bags contained sugar. There were no explosives. In the coming days, FSB officials would explain that the 2 men and 1 woman who had planted the sacks were FSB officials from Moscow, that the sacks contained perfectly harmless sugar, that the whole exercise had been intended to test the alertness of the ordinary people of Ryazan and the battle readiness of Ryazan's law enforcement. Ryazan officials failed to cooperate at first, but then confirmed the FSB story, explaining that the bomb squad had misidentified the sugar as explosive because its testing equipment had been contaminated through extensive use on real explosives in Chechnya. The explanations did little to calm fears, or to convince anyone who knew anything about the way the FSB worked. It seemed unconcisable but not unimaginable that a couple of hundred people would be held outside, scared and cold, for an entire night for the sake of a training exercise. After all, the Russian secret police was not known for its considerate ways. What utterly defied explanation, though, was the fact that the local chapter of the FSB had not been informed of the exercise, so that the Interior Minister was allowed to embarrass himself in public a day and a half after the exercise, and after 1,200 of his troops had been mobilized to catch the suspects as they fled Ryazan. Over the course of 6 months, NTV journalists had pieced together the story, riddled as it was with inconsistencies, and now they presented it to the viewers. They tried to tread carefully. Nikolaev, the host, began with the premise that what had happened in Ryazan had indeed been a training exercise. When a member of the audience suggested that it was time to put together the entire chain of events and ask whether the FSB had been involved in the August and September explosions, Nikolaev practically shouted, "No, we are not going to do that. We are not going to go there. We are talking only about Ryazan." Still, the picture that emerged from the show was chilling. Nikolaev had invited many of the residents of 14 Novoseliv Street, including Kartofelnikov, to be in the studio audience. None of them believed the training exercise story. Then an audience member identified himself as a resident of the Ryazan building and began saying he believed it was an exercise. The other residents turned to him incredulously and within seconds began shouting in unison that they did not know the man and he certainly did not live in their building. The rest of the FSB's case was as unconvincing and as sordidly executed as the act of planting a fake resident in the audience. The FSB representatives could not explain why the initial test showed the substance was hexogen, or why the local chapter of the FSB was unaware of the supposed exercise. Watching the program, I thought back to the conversation I had with my editor half a year earlier. In just 6 months, the limits of the possible had shifted in my mind. I could now believe the FSB had most likely been behind the deadly bombing that shook Russia and helped make Putin its leader. When the agency suddenly found itself on the verge of being exposed, when 1,200 Ryazan's policemen had set out on a manhunt, armed with detailed descriptions of the FSB agent who had planted explosives, the FSB quickly came up with the training exercise story, unconvincing but sufficiently to prevent the arrest of secret police agents by regular police. The deadly chain of explosions halted at the same time. It took Boris Berezovsky much longer to acknowledge that the unthinkable was possible and even unlikely. I asked him about it almost 10 years later. By this time, he had personally funded investigations, books and a film that built on and extended Nikolaev's investigation and had come to believe that it had been at the FSB that terrorized Russia in September 1999, but he still had a very difficult time reconciling what he had thought was happening in 1999 with his later views of those events. I can tell you with absolute sincerity that at the time I was sure it was the Chechens, he told me. It was when I came here to London and started looking back that I eventually came to the conclusion that the explosions were organized by the FSB. And this conclusion was based not only on logic, but even so much on logic as on facts. But at the time I did not see those facts, thus I did not trust NTV, which belonged to Guzinski, who supported Primakov. So I did not even pay attention, and it never even occurred to me that there was a parallel game to ours. that someone else was doing what they thought was right to get Putin elected. Now I am convinced that was exactly what was going on. The someone else would have been the FSB, and the parallel game would have been the explosions intended to unite Russians in fear and in desperate desire for a new, decisive, even aggressive leader who would spare no enemy. But I am certain the idea itself was not Putin's, he suddenly said. This made no sense to me. The explosions began just 3 weeks after Putin was appointed Prime Minister. That would suggest that preparations began while he was still head of the FSB. Berezovsky objected that this was not necessarily the case. It was all organized in a very short time, and this was why there were so many obvious mistakes they made, even if Berezovsky was correct. However, Putin was succeeded at the FSB by his right-hand man, Patrushev, who would hardly have hidden the plan from Putin. And if Putin had first-hand knowledge of such a relatively minor operation as the detention of Andrei Babitsky, then it seemed absurd to imagine he had not known of the planned bombing spree. Berezovsky agreed, although he still would not lay the entire enterprise at Putin's feet. He said he had come to believe that the idea had originated in Putin's inner circle, but had not been intended to support Putin himself. It was designed to boost any successor of Yeltsin's choosing. I thought Berezovsky might have devised this story to allow himself to go on believing he had been the kingmaker and just a pawn in 1999. On the other hand, I had to admit he was probably right that explosions could have been used to elect anyone. If enough blood was shed, any previously unknown, faceless and unqualified candidate could become president, even if he was chosen practically at random. Officially, Moscow's position remained that all the explosions were organized by an Islamic terrorist group based in the Caucasus. Chapter 3. The Autobiography of a Thug. The group Berezovsky has assembled to write Putin's biography had only 3 weeks to produce a book. The list of sources was limited. They had Putin himself, 6 long sit-down interviews, his wife, his best friend, a former teacher and a former secretary from St. Petersburg City Hall. They were not there to investigate the man. Their job was to write down a legend. It turned out to be the legend of a post-war Leningrad thug. St. Petersburg is a Russian city of grand history and glorious architecture, but the Soviet city of Leningrad, into which Vladimir Putin was born in 1952, was in the lived experience of its people, a city of hunger, poverty, destruction, aggression, and death. Just 8 years had elapsed since the end of the siege of Leningrad. The siege had begun when Nazi troops completed their circle around the city, severing all connections to Leningrad on September 8, 1941, and ended 72 days later. More than 1 million civilians died, killed by hunger or by artillery fire, which was unceasing for the duration of the blockade. Nearly half of these people died on their way out of the city. The lone route not controlled by the Germans bore the name the Road of Life, and hundreds of thousands of civilians died along this road, killed by bombs and famine. No city in modern times has seen famine and loss of life on this scale, and yet many survivors believed the authorities intentionally underestimated the number of casualties. No one knows how long it takes a city to recover from violence so profound and grief so pervasive. Imagine a soldier who is living a life of peacetime routine but is surrounded with the same walls and the same objects as were with him in the trenches. Wrote some years after the war, the authors of an oral history of the siege of Leningrad, trying to conjure the extent to which the city was still living the siege. The ceilings, antique molding bears the traces of shrapnel. The glossy surface of the piano bears the scratches left by broken glass. The shiny parquet floor has a burned-in stain where the wood burning stove used to stand. Bourgeois movable cast iron wood burning stoves were what Leningrad residents used to heat their apartments during the siege. The city's furniture and books had gone into them. The black pot varied stoves were a symbol of despair and abandonment. The authorities, who had assured Soviet citizens they were well protected against all enemies and that Germany was friend, not foe, had left the people of the country's second largest city to starve and freeze to death. And then, when the siege was over, they had invested in restoring the glorious suburban palaces looted by the Germans, but not in restoring the residential buildings in the city itself. Vladimir Putin was raised in an apartment that still had a wood-burning stove in every room. His parents, Maria and Vladimir Putin, had survived the siege in the city. The elder Vladimir Putin had joined the army in the early days of Soviet-German war and had been wounded seriously in battle, not far from Leningrad. He was taken to a hospital inside the line of the siege and Maria found him there. After several months in the hospital, he remained severely disabled. Both of his legs were disfigured and caused him great physical pain for the rest of his life. The elder Putin was discharged from the military and returned home with Maria. Their only son, who must have been between 8 and 10 years old at the time, was staying at one of the several homes for children organized in the city, apparently in the hope that institutions could provide better care than desperate and starving parents. The boy died there. Maria came close to death herself. By the time the siege was lifted, she was no longer strong enough to walk on her own. There were the future president's parents, a disabled man, a woman who had come very close to dying from starvation, and who had lost her children. A second child, son, had died in infancy several years before the war. But by the measure of the post-war Soviet Union, the Putins were lucky. They had each other. Following the war, there were nearly twice as many women of childbearing age as there were men. Statistics aside, the war had brought tragedy in virtually every family, separating husbands and wives, destroying homes and displacing millions. To have lived not only through the war but through the siege, and to still have your spouse and your home was essentially a miracle. The younger Vladimir Putin's birth was another miracle, so unlikely that it has given life to the precedent rumor that the Putins adopted him. On the eve of the Putin's first presidential election, a woman came forward in Georgia, in the Caucasus, claiming she had given him up for adoption when he was 9 years old. A number of side articles and a book or two advancing this story followed, and indeed even Natalia Zhivolkian was inclined to believe the story. She found his parents strikingly doting, and the fact that the team of biographers found no one who remembered knowing the boy before he reached school age reinforced her suspicion. It is, however, not only impossible to prove or disprove the adoption theory but also unnecessary. The indisputable fact is whether biological or adopted. Vladimir Putin was, by the standards of his time, was a miracle child. Because Vladimir Putin was catapulted to power from obscurity, and because he spent his entire adult life within the confines of a secret and secretive institution, he has been able to exercise greater control over what is known about him than almost any other modern politician, certainly more than any modern Western politicians. He has created his own mythology. This is a good thing, because to a far greater extent than is usually possible for any man, Vladimir Putin has communicated to the world directly what he would like to be known about him and how he would like to be seen. What has emerged is very much the mythology of a child of post-siege Leningrad, a mean, hungry, impoverished place that bred man, hungry, ferocious children. At least they were the ones who survived. One entered the building in which Putin grew up through the courtyard. St. Petersburg residents call these formations well courtyards. encroached on all sides by tall apartment buildings. They make a person feel as if he were standing at the bottom of a giant stone well. Like all such courtyards, this one was strewn with trash, potholed and unlit. So was the building itself. The 19th century stairs were crumbling and the stairwell barely had a working light bulb. Chunks of the handrails were missing, and the rest of the construction wobbled badly. The Putin lived on the top floor of the 5-story building, and the journey up the dark stairs could be risky. Like most apartments in central Leningrad, this was part of a flat once built with well-off renters in mind, then divided into 2 or 3 apartments, only to be split again among several families. The Putin's apartment did not have a proper kitchen, so a single gas stove and a sink were stationed in the narrow hallway. One entered from the stairwell. There, 3 families used a 4-burner stove to prepare their meal. A makeshift but permanent toilet had been constructed by annexing part of the stairwell. The small space was unheated to bath. The residents would heat water on the gas stove and then wash themselves while passed over the toilet in the tiny cold room. Vladimir Putin the younger was naturally the only child in the apartment. An older married couple lived in a windowless room that was eventually just uninhabitable. An old observant Jewish couple, their grown daughter, occupied a room on the other side of the hallway cum kitchen from the Putins. Conflict flared regularly in the communal kitchen, but the adults apparently cooperated in shielding the boy from their quarrels. Putin often spent time playing in the Jewish family's room, and speaking to his biographer, he made a striking assertion, claiming he did not differentiate between his parents and the old Jews. The Putin had the largest room in the flat, around 20 square meters, or rough 12 feet by 15. By the standards of the time, this was an almost palatial abode for a family of 3. Almost incredibly, the Putins also had a television set, a telephone and a dacha, a cabin outside the city. The elder Vladimir Putin worked as a skilled laborer at a train car factory. Maria took back-breaking, unskilled jobs that allowed her to spend time with her son. She worked as a night watchman, a cleaning woman, a loader. But if one examines the fine shades of post-war Soviet poverty, the Putins emerge as practically rich, given their unceasing doting on their son. This sometimes produced noteworthy results, such as first grader Vladimir sporting a wristwatch, a rare, expensive and prestigious accessory for any age group in that time and place. The school was just a few steps from the building where the Putins lived. The education offered was, from what one can gather, unremarkable. The teacher for the first 4 grades was a very young woman who was finishing her college education by going to night school. Not that education was a priority in 1960. When Putin entered first grade at the age of almost 8, his father was by all accounts concerned primarily with discipline, not with the quality of schooling his son received. Nor was education part of the younger Putin's idea of success. He has placed a great emphasis on portraying himself as a thug, and in this he has had the complete cooperation of his childhood friends. By far, the largest amount of biographical information available about him, that is, the bulk of the information made available to his biographers, concerns the many fist fights of his childhood and youth. The courtyard is a central fixture of post-war Soviet life, and Vladimir Putin's personal mythology is very much rooted in it, with adults working a 6-day week and childcare generally non-existent. Soviet children tended to grow up in the communal spaces outside their overcrowded apartment buildings. In Putin's case, this meant growing up at the bottom of the well courtyard. This is strewn with litter and populated by toughs. Some courtyards this was. His former classmate and longtime friend Viktor Borisenko told her biographer, thugs all, unwashed, unshaven guys with cigarettes and bottle of cheap wine. Constant drinking, cursing, fist fights, and there was Putin in the middle of all this. When we were older, we would see the thugs from his courtyard, and they had drunk themselves into the ground. They were hitting bottom. Many of them had been to jail. In other words, they did not manage to get good lives for themselves. Putin, younger than the thugs and slight of build, tried to hold his own with them. If anyone ever insulted him in any way, his friend recalled, Volodya would immediately jump on the guy, scratch him, bite him, whip his hair out by the crumb, do anything at all, never to allow anyone to humiliate him in any way. Putin brought his fighting ways to grade school with him. References to fist fights abound in the recollections of his former schoolmates. But the following description gives a telling snapshot of the future president's temperament. The labor shop dragged Putin by the collar from his classroom to ours. We had been making dustpans in his class and Vladimir had done something wrong. It took him a long time to calm down. The process itself was interesting. It would start to look like he was feeling better, like it was all over, and then he would flare up again and start expressing his outrage. He did this several times over. The school punished Putin by excluding him from the Young Pioneers organization, a rare, almost exotic form of punishment, generally reserved for children who were held back repeatedly and essentially deemed hopeless. Putin was a marked boy. For 3 years, he was the only child in a school who did not wear a red kerchief around his neck, symbolizing membership in the communist organization for 10 to 14 years old. Putin's outcast status was all the more peculiar considering how well off he was compared with the other children at his school, most of whom were statistically unlikely to be living with two parents. But to Putin, his thug credentials represented true status, flaunted in his responses to his biographers in 2000. Why did you not get inducted into the Young Pioneers until 6th grade? Were things really so bad? Of course, I was no pioneer. I was a hooligan. Are you putting an else? You are trying to insult me. I was a real thug. Putin's social, political, and academic standing changed when he was 13. As a 6th grader, he began to apply himself academically and was rewarded not only with induction into the Young Pioneers, but immediately after by election to the post of class chairman. The fighting continued unabated. However, Putin's friends told his biographer a series of fighting stories, the same plot repeating itself year after year. We were playing a game of chase out in the street. A grade school classmate recalled. Volodya was passing by and he saw that a boy much older and bigger than me is chasing me and I am running as hard as I can. He jumped in, trying to protect me. A fight ensued. Then we shouted it out, of course. We were in 8th grade. When we were standing at a tram stop, waiting, we counted another friend. A tram pulled up, but it was not going where we needed to go. Two huge drunken men got off and started trying to pick a fight with somebody. They were cursing and pushing people around. Bobka calmly handed his bag over to me and then I saw that he had just sent one of the men flying into a snowbank. Face first, the second one turned around and started at Volodya screaming. What was that? A couple of seconds later, he knew exactly what it was because he was lying there next to his body. That was just when our tram pulled up. If there is anything I can say about Bobka, it's that he never let bastards and waskers who insult people and bug them get away with it. As a young KGB officer, Putin reenacted his earlier fights. He once invited me to witness the procession of the cross at Easter, because still another friend. He was on duty helping cordon off the procession and he asked me if I wanted to come see the altar in the church. I said yes, of course. It was such a boyish thing to do. No one was allowed there, but we could just go in. So after the procession of the cross, we were on our way home and we were standing at a bus stop. Some people came up to us. They did not look like criminals, more like college students who had had a bit to drink. They say, "You got a smoke." Bobka says no, and they say, "What are you doing?" answering like that, and he says nothing. And I did not even have time to see what happened after. One of them must have hit him or pushed him. I just saw someone's stocking feet slide past me. The guy went flying somewhere. And Borod says to me, all calm, "Let's go out of here," and we left. I really liked the way he threw that guy who tried to pick on him. 1 second and his feet were up in the air. The same friend recalled that a few years later, when attending spy school in Moscow, he came home to Leningrad for a few days, only to get into a fight on the subway. Someone picked on him and he took care of the thug. The friend and told Putin's biographers. Borodya was very upset. "They are not going to be understanding about this in Moscow," he said. "There will be consequences, and I guess he did get into some kind of trouble, though he never told me any details. It all worked out in the end." Putin, it would appear, reacted to the barest provocation by getting into a street brawl, risking his KGB career, which would have been derailed had he detained for the fight or even so much as noticed by the police. Whether or not the stories are exactly true, it's notable that Putin has painted himself and allowed himself to be painted by others as a consistent D-West, physically violent man with a very containable temper. The image he has chosen to present is all the more remarkable because it seems inconsistent with a discipline to which Putin devoted his teenage years. At the age of 10 or 11, Putin went shopping for a place where he could learn skills to supplement his sheer will to fight. Boxing proved too painful. He had his nose broken during one of his first training sessions. Then he found Sambo. Sambo, an acronym for the Russian translate as self-defense without weapons, is a Soviet martial art, a hodgepodge of judo, karate and folk wrestling moves. His parents were opposed to the boy's new hobby. Maria called it foolishness and seemed to fear for her child's safety, and the elder Vladimir forbade the lessons. The coach had to pay several visits to the Putin's room before the boy was allowed consistently to attend the daily training sessions. Sambo, with its discipline, became part of the Putin's transformation from a great school thug into a goal-directed and hard-working adolescent. It was also linked to what had become an overriding ambition. Putin had apparently heard that the KGB expected new recruits to be skilled in hand-to-hand combat. Imagine a boy who dreams of being a KGB officer when everyone else wants to be a cosmonaut. Gabor Kian said to me, trying to explain how odd Putin's passion seemed to her. I did not find it quite so far-fetched. In the 1960s, Soviet cultural authorities invested heavily in creating a romantic, even glamorous image of the secret police. When Vladimir Putin was 12, a novel called The Shield and the Sword became a bestseller. Its protagonist was a Soviet intelligence officer working in Germany. When Putin was 15, the novel was made into a widely popular mini-series. 43 years later, as Prime Minister, Putin would meet with 11 Russian spies deported from the United States, and together, in a show of camaraderie and nostalgia, they would sing the theme song from the mini-series. When I was in 9th grade, I was influenced by films and books, and I developed a desire to work for the KGB, Putin told his biographer. There is nothing special about that. The protestation begs the question. Was there something else besides books and movies that formed what became Putin's single-minded passion? It seems there was, and Putin hid it in plain sight, as the best spies do. We all want our children to grow up to a better, more successful version of ourselves. Vladimir Putin, the miraculous late son of two pupils, maimed and crippled by World War II, was born to be a Soviet spy. In fact, he was born to be a Soviet spy in Germany. During World War II, the senior Vladimir Putin had been assigned to so-called subversive troops, small detachments formed to act behind enemy lines. These troops reported to the NKVD, as the Soviet secret police was then called, and were formed largely from the ranks of NKVD. They were on a suicide mission. No more than 15% of them survived the first 6 months of the war. Vladimir Putin's detachment was typical. 28 soldiers were airdropped into a forest behind enemy lines, about 100 miles from Leningrad. They had about enough time to get their bearings and blow up one train when they ran out of food supplies. They asked the locals for food. The villagers fed them and then turned them into the Germans. Several of the men managed to break out. The Germans gave chase, and Vladimir Putin hid in a swamp, submerging his head and breathing through a reed until the search party had given up. He was one of the only 4 survivors of that mission. Wars give birth to bizarre stories, and a legend with which the younger Vladimir Putin grew up is as likely to have been true as any other tale of miraculous survival and spontaneous heroism. It may also very well explain why he signed up for a German language elective in 4th grade, when he was still a notoriously poor student. It certainly explains why, as a schoolboy, Putin had a portrait of the founding father of Soviet spyhood propped up on his desk at the dacha. His closest childhood friend recalled it was some intelligence officer for sure, because Borodkas told me it was, and Putin supplied his biographers with the name of his idol, Jan Bergen, hero of the revolution, founder of Soviet military intelligence, creator of spy outposts in all European countries, was, like many early Bolsheviks, arrested and shot in the late 1930s for an imagined anti-Stalin plot. His name was restored to honor in 1956, but has remained obscure ever since. You would have had to be a true KGB geek, not only to know the name but to have secured the portrait. It is not clear whether the elder Vladimir Putin had worked for the secret police before the war or continued to work for the NKVD after. It seems probable enough that he remained part of the so-called active reserve, a giant group of secret police officers who held regular jobs while also informing for and drawing a salary from the KGB. This may explain why the Putin lived so comparatively well. The dacha, the television set, and the telephone, especially the telephone. At the age of 16, a year before finishing secondary school, Vladimir Putin went to the KGB headquarters in Leningrad to try to sign up. A man came out. He recalled for a biographer. He did not know who I was, and I never saw him again after that. I told him I go to school and in the future I would like to work for the state security services. I asked if it was possible and what I would have to do to achieve it. The man said they don't usually sign up volunteers, but the best way for me would be to go to college or serve in the military. I asked him which college. He said a law college or law department of the university would be best. He surprised everyone by saying he would be applying to the university. His class teacher, the equivalent of a homeroom teacher in the United States, told his biographers. I asked how. He said, I will handle it myself. Leningrad University was one of the 2 or 3 most prestigious institutions of higher learning in the Soviet Union, certainly by far the most competitive in the city. How a mediocre student from a family that could by no means be considered well connected, even if I am correct in assuming that the elder Putin worked for the secret police, planned to gain admission was a mystery. His parents apparently protested, as did his coach. All of them favored a college to which Putin would be more likely to be accepted, which in turn would keep him out of mandatory military service and close to home. Putin graduated from secondary school with the grades of excellent in history, German and gym, good in geography, Russian and literature, and satisfactory, the equivalent of a C, in physics, chemistry, algebra and geometry. Leningrad University reportedly had 40 pupils applying for a single spot. How did Putin get it? It is just possible that his determination was great enough that he could prepare himself for the grueling exams at the expense of his high school work, a strategy that would have taken advantage of the fact that the university based exam admissions decisions solely on a series of written and oral exams, not on transcript. It is also possible that KGB ensured he would get in. At university, Putin kept to himself as he had in the last couple of years of secondary school. Staying out of community and komsomol activities, he kept his grades up and spent his free time training in judo. His coach and teammates had traded in sambo for an Olympic martial art and driving around in his car. Putin was more than likely the only student at Leningrad University who owned a car. In the early 1970s, a car in the Soviet Union was a rarity. Mass car production was in gestation. Even 20 years later, the number of cars per thousand people in the USSR barely reached 60 compared with 781 in the United States. A car more cost roughly as much as a Dacia. The Putins won the car, a late model two-door with a motorcycle engine, in a lottery, and rather than take the money, which would have been enough to get them out of the communal apartment and into a separate flat in a newly constructed building on the outskirts, gave the car to their son. That they gave the younger Putin this lavish gift and that he accepted it are further examples of Putin's extraordinarily doting relationship with their son, or their incongruous riches, or both. Whatever the reason, Putin's relationships to money, extravagant and strikingly selfish for his social context, appears to have taken shape during his university years. Like other students, he spent his summers working on far-flung construction sites where the pay was very good. The state compensated laborers well for the danger and hardship of working in the far north. Putin made 1,000 rubles one summer and 500 the following year, enough to say put a new roof on the Dacia. Any other young Soviet man in his position, an only son, living with entirely financially dependent on his father, parents, both of them past retirement age, would have been expected to give all or most of that money to his family. But the first summer, Putin joined two classmates in traveling straight from the far north to the Soviet south, the town of Gagri on the Black Sea in Georgia, where he managed to spend all his money in a few days. The following year, he returned to Leningrad after working on a construction site and spent the money he had made on an overcoat for himself and a frosted cake for his mother. All through my university years, I kept waiting for that man I spoke to at KGB headquarters to remember me, Putin told his biographer, but they had forgotten all about me because I had been a schoolboy when I came, but I remembered they do not sign up volunteers, so I made no moves myself. 4 years went by, silence. I decided the issue was closed and started looking around for other possible job assignments. But when I was in my 4th year, I was contacted by a man who said he wanted to meet with me. He did not say who he was, but somehow he knew right away because he said, "We will be talking about your future job assignment. That is what I would like to discuss with you. I am not going to be any more specific for now." That's when I figured it out. If he does not want to say where he works, that means he works there. The KGB officer met with Putin 4 or 5 times and concluded that he was not particularly outgoing, but energetic, flexible and brave. Most important, he was good at connecting with people fast, a key quality for a KGB officer, especially if he plans to work in intelligence. The day Putin learned he would be working for the KGB, he came to see Viktor Borisenko, who had remained his best friend since grade school. He says, "Let's go." I say, "Where are we going? Why?" He does not answer. We get in his car and go. Borisenko told an interviewer, "We pull up at a Caucasian food place. I am intrigued. I am trying to figure out what's going on, but I never did. It was just clear that something extremely important had happened, but Putin is not telling me what. He is not even giving any hints, but he was already celebratory. Something very important had happened in his life. Only later did I understand that this was how my friend was celebrating. With me, he's going to work for the KGB. Later, Putin made no secret of his work for the KGB. He told a cellist named Sergei Vordugin, who would become his best friend almost as soon as the two met. Vordugin, who had traveled abroad with his orchestra and had seen KGB handlers at work, says he was apprehensive and curious at first. Once I tried to get him to talk about some operation that had gone down and I failed. He told Putin's biographer. Another time I said to him, "I am a cellist and that means I play the cello. I will never be surgeon. What's your job?" "I mean, I know you are an intelligence officer, but what does that mean? Who are you? What can you do?" And he said, "I am an expert in human relations." That was the end of the conversation. He really thought he knew something about people. And I was impressed. I was proud and very much treasured the fact that he was an expert in human relations. The skeptical note in Vordugin, "He really thought he knew something," is as clear and unmistakable in the original Russian as it is in the English translation. But it seems that both Vordugin and Putin, who certainly vetted the code, missed it. Putin's own descriptions of his relationships paint him as a strikingly inept communicator. He had one significant relationship with a woman before meeting his future wife. He left her at the altar. That's how it happened, he told his biographers, explaining nothing. It was really hard. He was no more articulate on the subject of the woman he actually married, nor, it seems, was he successful at communicating his feelings to her during their courtship. They dated for more than 3 years, an extraordinarily long time by Soviet or Russian standards, and at a very advanced age. Putin was almost 31 when they married, which made him a member of a tiny minority, less than 10% of Russians, who remained unmarried past the age of 30. The future Mrs. Putin was a domestic flight attendant from the Baltic Sea city of Kaliningrad. They had met through an acquaintance. She has gone on record saying it was by no means love at first sight. For at first sight, Putin seemed unremarkable and poorly dressed. He has never said anything publicly about his love for her. In their courtship, it seems, she was both the more emotional and the more insistent one. Her description of the day he finally proposed paints a picture of a failure to communicate so profound that it is surprising these people actually managed to get married and have 2 children. One evening we were sitting in his apartment and he says, "Little friend, by now you know what I am like. I am basically not a very convenient person." And then he went on to describe himself, "Not a talker, can be pretty harsh, can hurt your feelings and so on. Not a good person to spend your life with." And he goes on, "Over the course of 3.5 years, you have probably made up your mind." I realized we were probably breaking up. So I said, "Well, yes, I have made up my mind." And he said, with doubt in his voice, "Really? That's when I knew we were definitely breaking up." "In that case," he said, "I love you and I propose we get married on such and such a day." And that was completely unexpected. They were married 3 months later. Ludmila quit her job and moved to Leningrad to live with Putin in the smaller of 2 rooms in an apartment he now shared with his parents. The apartment in a new concrete block monstrosity, about 40 minutes by subway from the center of town, and had been the Putin's since 1977. The younger Vladimir Putin had a room of his own for the first time at the age of 25. It was about 130 square feet, and it had a single window placed so oddly high that one had to be standing to be able to look out of it. The newlyweds' living conditions, in other words, were roughly similar to those of millions of other Soviet couples. Ludmila enrolled at Leningrad University, where she studied philosophy. She became pregnant and with their first child about a year after the wedding. While she was pregnant and for a few months after she had Maria, her husband was in Moscow, involved in a year-long course that would prepare him for service in the Foreign Intelligence Corps. She had none. He worked for the KGB long before the wedding, even though initially he told her he was a police detective. Such was his cover. That Putin seems not to have been consciously about using his cover is probably an indication that he was not sure what exactly he was covering up. His ambition, or more accurately his dream, had been to have secret powers or of sorts. I was not amazed by how a small force, a single person, really can accomplish something an entire army cannot. He told his biographers, a single intelligence officer could rule over the fates of thousands of people. At least that's how I saw it. Putin wanted to rule the world, or a part of it, from the shadows. That is very much the role he ultimately achieved. But when he first joined the KGB, his prospects of ever having anything significant or remotely interesting to do seemed far from certain. In the middle to late 1970s, when Putin joined the KGB, the secret police, like all Soviet institutions, was undergoing a phase of extreme bloating. Its growing number of directorates and departments were producing mountains of information that had no clear purpose, application, or meaning. An entire army of men and a few women spent their lives compiling newspaper clippings, transcripts of taped telephone conversations, reports of people followed, and trivia learned. And all of this made its way to the top of the KGB pyramid, and then to the leadership of the Communist Party, largely unprocessed and virtually unanalyzed. Only the Central Committee of the Communist Party had the right to think in broad political categories, wrote the last chairman of the KGB, whose task it was to dismantle the institution. The KGB was relegated to collecting primary information and carrying out decisions made as well. This structure excluded the possibility of developing a tradition of strategic political thinking within the KGB itself, but it was unparalleled in its ability to supply information of the sort and in the amount in which it was ordered. In other words, the KGB took the concept of carrying out orders to its logical extreme. Its agents saw what they were told to see, heard what they were told to hear, and reported back exactly what was expected of them. The internal ideology of the KGB, as of any police organization, rested on a clear concept of the enemy. The institution thrived on a siege mentality, which has driven the massive manhunts and purges of the Stalin era. But Putin entered the service not only in the post-Stalin era, but also during one of the very few, very brief periods of peace in Soviet history, after Vietnam and before Afghanistan. The country was involved in no ongoing armed conflict, covertly or openly. The only active enemies were the dissidents, a handful of brave souls who drew a disproportionate amount of KGB force. A new law, Article 190 of the Penal Code, made it a crime to spread rumors or information detrimental to the Soviet societal and governmental structure, giving the KGB virtually unlimited power in hunting down and fighting those who dared to think differently. Dissidents, suspected dissidents, and those leaning toward activities that might be considered dissidents, were the objects of constant surveillance and harassment. Putin claims not to have taken part in anti-dissident work, but has shown in interviews that he was thoroughly familiar with the way it was organized, probably because he was lying about not having done it. A perfectly raw, dirty memoir of Putin, written by a former colleague who defected to the West in the late 1980s, mentioned matter-of-factly that in Leningrad Putin worked for the 5th Directorate created to fight the dissidents. After university, Putin spent half a year pushing papers at the KGB offices in Leningrad. Then he spent 6 months going to KGB officer school. It was an entirely unremarkable school in Leningrad. He told his biographers, one of the dozens across the country where university graduates got their secret police qualification. After graduation, Putin was assigned to the counterintelligence unit in Leningrad. It was a backwater assignments. Counterintelligence officers in Moscow spent their time training suspected or non-foreign intelligence agents, almost all of whom worked at foreign embassies in the city. There were no embassies in Leningrad and no one really to drill. After 6 months in the counterintelligence unit, Putin was sent to Moscow for a one-year training course and then returned to Leningrad, now assigned to the intelligence unit. It was another dreary assignment, and Putin was stuck in it, like hundreds, possibly thousands, of unremarkable young men who had once dreamed of being spies and who now waited for someone to notice them. But they had been drafted by the bloated KGB for no particular reason and no particular purpose. So their waiting time could be long and even endless. Putin waited for 4.5 years. His break came in 1984 when he was finally sent to spy school in Moscow for a year. There, the 32-year-old KGB major seems to have done everything possible to show just how much he needed this job. He wore a 3-piece suit in sweltering heat, for example, to demonstrate respect and discipline. It was a wise strategy. The spy school was, in a sense, a very long, involved and labor-intensive placement service. The students were studied carefully by the faculty, who would be making recommendations on their future. One of Putin's instructors criticized Putin for his lowered sense of danger, a serious flaw for a potential spy. His mastery of intelligence instructor. In a sense, the communication coach said Putin was a closed, not very social person. Overall, however, he was a good student, entirely devoted to his work at the school. He was even appointed class foreman, his first leadership position since he was elected class chairman in 6th grade, and apparently did his job well. Barring an unexpected disaster, Putin knew he would be assigned to work in Germany. Much of his work at spy school had focused on improving his language skill. He would eventually become fluent in German, but he never managed to lose his thick Russian accent. The big question at graduation then was whether he would be going to East or West Germany. The former, while unquestionably vaguely appealing because it was a foreign assignment, was not at all what Putin had been dreaming of for nearly 20 years by now. It would not be espionage work. For that, he would have to be assigned to West Germany. What ultimately happened felt just sort of failure. Following a year at spy school, Putin would be going to Germany but not to West Germany and not even to Britain. He was assigned to the industrial city of Dresden. At the age of 33, Putin, with Ludmila, who was once again pregnant, and 1-year-old Maria, traveled to another backwater assignment. This was a job for which he had worked and waited for 20 years, and he would not even be undercover. The Putin, like 5 other Russian families, were given an apartment in a large apartment block in a little Stasi world. Secret police staff lived here, worked in a building a 5-minute walk away, and sent their children to nursery school in the same compound. They walked home for lunch and spent evenings at home or visiting colleagues in the same building. Their job was to collect information about the enemy, which was the best, meaning West Germany and especially United States military bases in West Germany, which were hardly more accessible from Dresden than they would have been from Leningrad. Putin and his colleagues were reduced mainly to collecting press clippings, thus contributing to the growing mountains of useless information produced by the KGB. Vladimir Putin liked Germany and the Germans, compared with the Soviet Unions. East Germany was a land of plenty, it was also a land of cleanliness and orderliness. She liked the way her German neighbors hung their identical cloakings laundry on parallel cloth lines at the same time every morning. Their neighbors, it seemed to her, lived better than the Putins were used to, so the Putins saved, buying nothings for their temporary apartment, hoping to go home with enough money to buy a car. The Putin had a second daughter and named her Ekaterina. Putin drank beer and got fat. He stopped training or exercising at all, and he gained over 20 pounds, a disastrous addition to his short and fairly narrow frame. From all appearances, he was seriously depressed. His wife, who has described their early years together as harmonious and joyful, has pointedly refrained from saying anything about their family life after spy school. She has said only that her husband never talked to her about work, not that there was much to tell. The staff of the KGB outpost in Dresden were divided among various KGB directorates. Putin was assigned to directorate as the Illegal Intelligence Gathering Unit. This was the KGB's own terminology denoting agents using assumed identities and falsified documents as opposed to legal intelligence gathering, carried out by people who did not hide their affiliation with the Soviet state. This might have been his dream posting, except that it was in Dresden, the job Putin had once coveted. Working to draft future undercover agents turned out to be not only tedious but fruitless. Putin and his two colleagues from the Illegal Intelligence Unit, aided by a retired Dresden policeman who also drew a salary from the unit, tracked down foreign students enrolled at Dresden University of Technology. There were a number of students from Latin America who the KGB hoped would eventually be able to go undercover in United States, and spent months gaining their confidence, often only to find that they did not have enough money to entice the young people to work for them. Money was a source of constant worry, hurt and envy. Soviet citizens viewed long-term foreign postings as an incomparable source of income, often enough to lay the foundation for a lifetime of good living back home. East Germany, however, was viewed as not quite foreign enough by ordinary people as well as by Soviet authorities. Salaries and perks there could hardly be compared with those in a real foreign land, which is to say a capitalist country. Shortly before the Putins arrived in Dresden, the government finally authorized small monthly hard currency payments, the equivalent of about $100, as part of the salaries of Soviet citizens working in the socialist bloc countries. Still, KGB staff in Dresden had to scrimp and save to ensure that at the end of their posting, they would have something to show for it. Over the years, certain conventions of frugality had set in, using newspapers instead of curtains to cover the windows, for example. But while all the Soviet agents lived in the same sort of squalor, Stasi agents who had apartments in the same building enjoyed a much higher standard of living. They made a lot more money. Still, it was in the West, so close and so unreachable for someone like Putin. Some other Soviet citizens posted in Germany had the right to go to West Berlin. That people had the things Putin really coveted. He made his wishes known to the very few Westerners with whom he came in contact, members of the radical group Red Army faction who took some of their orders from the KGB and occasionally came to Dresden for training sessions. He always wanted to have things A former RAF member told me of Putin. He mentioned to several people wishes that he wanted from the West. This particular man claims to have personally presented Putin with a Grundig satellite, a state-of-the-art short-wave radio, and a blau-punked stereo for his car. He bought the former and prepared the latter from one of the many cars the RAF had stolen for its purpose. The West German radicals always came bearing gifts when they went east, the former radical told me. But there was a difference between the way Stasi agents received the goods and the way Putin approached it. The East Germans did not expect us to pay for it, so they would at least make an effort to say, "What do I owe you?" And we would say nothing, and Bova never even started asking, "What do I owe you?" Handing out assignments to RAF radicals who were responsible for more than 24 assassinations and terrorist attacks between 1970s and 1998 is exactly the sort of work Putin had once dreamed of, but there is no evidence he was directly connected to it. Instead, he spent most of his days sitting at his desk in a room he shared with one other agent. Every other officer in the Dresden building had his own office. His day began with a morning staff meeting, continued with a meeting with his local agent, the retired police officer, and finished with writing. Every agent had to give a complete accounting of his activities, including Russian translations of any information he had obtained. Former agents estimate they spent 3/4 of their time writing reports. Putin's biggest success in his stay in Dresden appears to have been in drafting a Colombian university student, who in turn connected the Soviet agents with a Colombian student at a school in West Berlin, who in turn introduced them to a Colombian-born US Army sergeant, who sold them an unclassified army manual for 800 marks. Putin and his colleagues had high hopes for the sergeant, but by the time they obtained a manual, Putin's time in Germany was coming to an end. Just when the Putins left the Soviet Union, that country began to change drastically and irrevocably. Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in March 1985. 2 years later, he had released all Soviet dissidents from prison and was beginning to loosen the reins on Soviet bloc countries. The KGB leadership as well as its rank and file perceived Gorbachev's actions as disasters. Over the next few years, a chase would open up between the party and the KGB, culminating with the failed coup in August 1991. Watching the changes from afar, surrounded by other secret police officers and no one else, Putin must have felt a hopeless, helpless fury. Back home, KGB leadership was pledging loyalty to the Secretary General and his planned reforms. In June 1989, the head of the KGB in Leningrad issued a public statement condemning secret police crimes committed under Stalin. In East Germany, as in the Soviet Union, people were beginning to come out into the streets to protest, and the unthinkable was quickly beginning to look probable. The two Germany might be reunited. The land Vladimir Putin had been sent here to guard would just be handed over to the enemy. Everything Putin had worked for was now in doubt. Everything he had believed was being mocked. This is the sort of the insult that would have prompted the Israeli little boy and young man that Putin had been to jump the offender and pound him until his fury had subsided. Middle-aged, out-of-shape Putin sat idle and silent as his dreams and hopes for the future were destroyed. In the late spring and early summer of 1989, Dresden faced its first unsanctioned gatherings. Handfuls of people collecting in public squares, first protesting the riggings of local elections in May and then, like the rest of Germany, demanding the right to emigrate to the West. In August, tens of thousands of East Germans actually traveled east, taking advantage of lifting of travel restrictions within the Soviet bloc, only to descend to West German embassies in Prague, Budapest, and Warsaw. A series of Monday night protests began across the cities of East Germany, growing bigger every week. East Germany shut its border, but it was too late to stem the tide of both emigrants and protesters, and an agreement was ultimately brokered to transport the Germans from east to west. They would travel by train, and the trains would pass through Dresden, the East German city closest to Prague. Indeed, first the empty trains would travel through Dresden on their way to pick up the nearly 8,000 East Germans who were occupying the West German embassy in Prague. In the early days of October, thousands of people began to gather at the train station in Dresden, some of them carrying heavy luggage, hoping somehow to hitch a ride to the West. Others simply there to witness the most astonishing event in the city's post-war history. The crowds met with all the law enforcement Dresden could gather. Regular police were joined by various auxiliary security forces, and together they threatened beat and detain as many people as they could. Unrest continued for several days. On October 7, Vladimir Putin's 37th birthday, East Germany celebrated the official 40th anniversary of its formation, and riots broke out in Berlin. More than 1,000 pupils were arrested. 2 days later, hundreds of thousands came out across the country for another Monday night demonstration, and their numbers more than doubled 2 weeks later. On November 9, the Berlin Wall fell, but demonstrations in East Germany continued until the first free elections in March. On January 15, 1999, a crowd formed outside the Stasi headquarters in Berlin to protest the reported destruction of documents by the secret police. The protesters managed to overcome the security forces and enter the building. Elsewhere in East Germany, protesters began storming Ministry of State security buildings. Even after a year, Putin told his biographers that he had been in the crowd and watched people storm the Stasi building in Dresden. One of the women was screaming, "Look for the entrance to the tunnel under the Elbe River. They have inmates there standing up to their knees in water." What inmates was she talking about? Why did she think they were under the Elbe? There were some detention cells there, but of course they were not under the Elbe. Putin generally found the protesters' rage excessive and bewildering. It was his friends and neighbors under attack, the very people with whom he had lived and socialized exclusively for the last 4 years, and he could not imagine any of them were as evil as the crowd claimed. They were just ordinary paper pusher, like Putin himself. When the protesters descended on a building where he worked, he was outraged. "I accept the Germans crashing their own Ministry of State security headquarters," he told his biographers a dozen years later. "That's their internal affairs. But we were not their internal affair. It was a serious threat, and we had documents in our building, and no one seemed to care enough to protect us. The guards at the KGB building must have fired warning shots." Putin said only that they demonstrated their will to do whatever was necessary to protect the building, and the protesters quieted down for a time. When they grew riotous again, Putin claimed he himself stepped outside. "I asked them what they wanted. I explained that this was a Soviet organization, and someone in the crowd asked, 'Why do you have cars with German license plates? What are you doing here anyway?' Like they knew exactly what we were doing there. I said that our contract allowed us to use German license plates, and who are you? Your German is too good. Too good." They started screaming. I told them I was an interpreter. These people were very aggressive. I phoned our military representatives and told them what was going on, and they said we cannot do anything until we have orders from Moscow, and Moscow is silent. A few hours later, our military did come and the crowd dispersed, but I remembered that Moscow is silent. I realized that Soviet Union was ill. It was a fatal illness called paralysis, a paralysis of power. His country, which he had served as well as he could, patiently accepting whatever role it saw fit to assign him, had abandoned Putin. He had been scared and powerless to protect himself, and Moscow had been silent. He spent the several hours before the military arrived inside the besieged building, shoving papers into a wood-burning stove until the stove split from the excessive heat. He destroyed everything he and his colleagues had worked to correct. All the contacts, personal files, surveillance reports, and probably endless press clippings. Even before the protesters had chased the Stasi out of their buildings, each German began the grueling and painful process of purging the Stasi from its society. All of the Putin's neighbors not only lost their job, but were banned from working in law enforcement, the government, or teaching. My neighbor with whom I had become friends spent a week crying. Ludmila Putin told her husband's biographer. She cried for the dreams she had lost, for the collapse of everything she had ever believed. Everything had been crushed, their lives, their career. Katya, Ekaterina, the Putin's youngest daughter, had a teacher at her preschool, a wonderful teacher, and she was now banned from working with children, all because she had worked for the Ministry of State Security. 12 years later, the incoming First Lady of post-Soviet Russia still found the logic of illustration incomprehensible and inhuman. The Putins returned to Leningrad. They carried a 20-year-old washing machine given to them by their former neighbors, who, even having lost their jobs, enjoyed a higher standard of living than the Putins would hope to attain back in the USSR, and a sum of money in US dollars, sufficient to buy the best Soviet-made car available. This was all they had to show for 4.5 years of living abroad, and for Vladimir Putin's unconsummate spy career. The four of them would be returning to the smaller of the two rooms in the elder Putin's apartment. Ludmila Putin would be reduced to spending most of her time scoring empty store shelves or standing in line to buy basic necessities. This was how most Soviet women spent their time. But after 4.5 years of a relatively comfortable life in Germany, it was not only humiliating but frightening. I was scared to go into stores, she told interviewers later. I would try to spend as little time as possible inside, just enough to get the bare necessities, and then I would run home. It was terrible. Could there have been a worse way to Soviet Union? Sergei Volodgun, Putin's cherished friend, remembered him saying, "They cannot do this, how could they? I see that I can make mistakes, but how can these people whom we think of as the best professionals make mistakes?" He said he would leave the KGB. Once a spy, always a spy. His friend responded. This was a common Soviet saying. Vladimir Putin felt betrayed by his country and his corporation, the only important affiliation he had ever known outside his judo club. But the corporation was filled with people who increasingly felt betrayed, misled, and abandoned. It would be fair to say this was the KGB's corporate spirit in 1990s. Chapter 4. Once a Spy. All of Russian history happens in St. Petersburg. The city was the capital of a prosperous empire depleted by World War I, at the start of which it lost its name. Germanic St. Petersburg became the more Russian-sounding Petrograd. The empire was destroyed by one-two punch of the revolutions of 1917, for both of which Petrograd provided the stage. Soon the city lost its capital status, as the seat of power was moved to Moscow. Petrograd, with its poets and artists, remained the capital of Russian culture, even as the city lost its name yet again, becoming Leningrad the day the first of Soviet tyrants died. The literary, artistic, academic, political, and business elites of the city would be gradually decimated by purges, arrests, and executions throughout the 1930s. That miserable decade closed with the Soviet Finnish War, a disastrously ill-conceived act of Soviet aggression that segued into World War II. During the siege and after World War II, Leningrad, to which Putin's parents had returned, was the city of ghosts. Its buildings, once majestic, stood rebuilt. The window glass had been blown out by the bombing and shelling. The window frames had been used for firewood, as had the furniture. Processions of the rats, hundreds and the thousands strong, would march past the building's pock-marked walls, taking up the entire width of the sidewalk, pushing aside the shadowy human survivors. In the post-war decades, the city swelled with new people and their work. Leningrad became the military-industrial capital of the Soviet Union. Hundreds of thousands of people from other parts of the empire settled in identical grey building blocks, which could not be erected fast enough to keep up with the influx. By the mid-1980s, the city's population was pushing 5 million, far exceeding capacity even by the modest living standards set in the Soviet Union. The heart of the city, its historic center, had meanwhile been all but abandoned by the city's builders. Those families like Putin's who had survived the hell of the first half of the 20th century by living in huge, rambling communal apartments in buildings that had once been great but now, after decades of disrepair, had entered the stage of irreversible decay. Yet the city to which Putin returned in 1990 had changed more in the 4 years he had been absent than it had changed in the 40 years before that. The very people Putin and his colleagues had kept in check and in fear, the dissidents, the almost dissidents, and the friends of dissidents, now acted as if they owned the city. On March 16, 1987, a massive explosion occurred in St. Isaac's Square in Leningrad. The blast brought down the angry Terry Hotel, whose grand facade had framed part of the city's most beautiful square for more than 150 years, and whose history was the stuff of legend and St. Petersburg's cultural legacy. The great poet Sergei Yasminin had committed suicide in room 5, which got the hotel mentioned in the work of at least half a dozen other poets. In a country and a city where the facts of history were most often whispered and the sites of history were frequently concealed, destroyed or faked, the angry Terry was a rare instance of an actual artifact, which is probably why many citizens of Peter the Great's city, much of which was literally crumbling, experienced the loss of this particular hotel as almost a personal injury. The demolition of the hotel was planned. What was not planned was the birth, at the site of the destruction, of a movement that would play a key role in bringing down the Soviet regime. Mikhail Gorbachev had become the leader of the Soviet state in March 1985. He had spent the first year of his reign solidifying his base in the Politburo. In his second year in office, he floated the term perestroika, restructuring, to no one, not even Gorbachev himself, quite knew what he meant. In December 1986, Gorbachev allowed the Soviet Union's best-known dissident, Nobel Peace Prize winner Andrei Sakharov, to return to his home in Moscow from the city of Gorky, where he had lived in internal exile for almost 7 years. In January 1987, Gorbachev advanced another new term, glasnost or openness, which did not for the then foreseeable future mean that censorship would be abolished, but it seemed to mean that censorship would change. For example, libraries across the country began loosening access to materials that had been kept under lock and key. In February 1987, Gorbachev commuted the sentences of 140 dissidents who had been serving time in Soviet prisons and labor colonies. To be sure, Gorbachev did not intend to dissolve the Soviet Union or to end the Communist Party's rule or early or really to change the regime in a radical way. Though he himself was fond of using the word radical, rather he dreamed of modernizing the Soviet economy and Soviet society in discrete ways, without undermining their basic structures. But the process he set in motion led inevitably and in retrospect very rapidly to the total collapse of the Soviet system. 5 years before the tectonic shift, subtle subterranean tremors began. Gorbachev had dangled the carrot of possible change, and so people began to talk about change as if it were possible. Cautiously, people began to allow these conversations to spill out their kitchens and into other people's living rooms. Huge alliances began to take shape. For the first time in decades, people were seriously discussing politics and pressing social issues neither as members of a dissident movements nor within the confines of formal Communist Party structures, which is how those who took part in these conversations became known as the informers. A majority of the informers belonged to a specific generation, those born during the Khrushchev thaw, the brief period in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when Stalinist terror had lifted and Brezhnev's stagnation had not yet set in. The informers had no common political platform or a common language for the discussion of politics or even a common understanding of the place of such a discussion. But they said two things: a distaste for the ways of the Soviet state and an abiding desire to protect and preserve what little was left of their beloved historic city. The people of our generation saw on your dead end ahead. If you did not escape, you did face degradation. Elena Zelenskaya recalled 20 years later. Zelenskaya put out one of several semi-dead publications that united the informers. We could no longer breathe among the lies, the hypocrisy and the stupidity. There was no fear, and as soon as the first rays of light seemed to break through, as soon as people whose hands had been tied were allowed to move at least a few fingers, people started to move. People were not thinking about money or about improving their standing in life. All anyone thought about was freedom. Freedom to conduct your private life as you wish. Freedom to travel and see the world. Freedom from hypocrisy and the freedom not to listen to hypocrisy. Freedom from rebels. Freedom from feeling ashamed for one's parents. Freedom from this curls lies in which all of us were submerged as if in molasses. But whatever the informers were saying in the privacy of their homes, the state machine of mindless destruction kept moving. On March 16, 1987, a rumor spread through the city the angry Terry Hotel was about to be razed. Informers of every stripe began to gather in front of the building. The leader of an informal preservation society, Alexei Kovalev, went inside the city government building, conveniently located in the same city square, and attempted to negotiate with a high-level bureaucrat there. She assured him the building was safe and implored him to stop misinforming people and spreading panic. Barely half an hour later, the blast sounded and the building, the size of a city block, turned into a huge cloud of coarse dust. This was when something entirely unprecedented happened. It seems after the dust and smoke settled where the hotel had been, all that should have remained were memories, recalled Alexander Vinikov, a physicist turned city activist. That is what happened. But the memories were outstanding. Never before this moment could people have imagined that they could protest the actions of authorities and remain intact, not even up behind bars or at least out of work. We carried away the memory of an amazing sense of being right, the sense that comes to a person who stands among like-minded people in a public space, listening to a speaker giving voice, convincingly and precisely to everyone's shared thoughts. And most important, we felt the full humiliation of the authorities' utter disregard for our opinion, and a sense of personal dignity began to swell up, a desire to affirm our right to be heard and to have an impact. So the crowd did not disperse. By the following afternoon, several hundred people were gathered in front of what used to be the angry terrace. The fence surrounding the demolition site was covered with homemade posters, flyers, poems written right on the fence, and simply the names of people who had taken part in the protest and had bravely chosen to make their names known. We all found one another in St. Isaac's Square. Read a President article written by Zelenskaya, then 33-year-old, and posted on the fence. We have set out on a difficult path. We will probably make a lot of mistakes. Some of us will probably lose our voices. We will probably fail to accomplish everything we will set out to do, just as we failed to save the angry Teddy. There really a lot we do not know how to do. Can people whose opinion no one ever asked really be expected to argue well? Can people who have long been kept out of any sort of public activity be expected to have honed their fighting skills while sitting in their basement? Can people whose decisions and actions have never had tangible consequences, even for their own lives, be expected to calculate the trajectory of their activities? Hundreds of people continued to rally at the site for 3 days. The protest that would not end became known as the Battle of the Angry Terry. And even after that, the fence, with its many protest posters and articles, remained, and so did an ongoing small gathering in front of it. People would now come to the Angry Terry to find out what was happening in their city and their country, or to tell others. The site became known as the information point. The kitchen and living room discussions had come out, and the fence turned into a living place on which scores of Samis that publications were emerging from the underground. Elsewhere in the city, other discussion venues were taking shape. In April, a group of young Leningrad economists formed a club. At their gatherings at the Palace of Youth, they took up unprecedented topics such as the possibility of privatization. Before the year was out, one of them would float the idea of privatizing state enterprise by issuing stock vouchers to every Soviet adult. The concept was not well received at the time, but years later this is exactly what would happen, and most of the club's participants would go on to play key roles in shaping post-communist economic policy. To those on the inside, Soviet society seemed to be changing at breathtaking speed, but the motion was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. In May, Soviet authorities stopped the jamming of most Western radio programs. On May 31st, Leningrad city authorities shut down the information point in front of the Angry Terry. In June, the local council elections contained a small but revolutionary experiment. In 4% of the district, instead of usual single name, 2 appeared on the ballot. For the first time in decades, a few voters were allowed to choose between candidates, even if both were advanced by the Communist Party. On December 10, Leningrad saw its first political rally that was not broken up by police. At least 2 of the speakers were men who had served time in the camps for opposing the Soviet regime. The process continued the following year. More discussion groups gradually formed, and their activities became more structured. Over time, actual leaders, people well known and trusted outside their small social circles, emerged. In a couple of years, they would become the first post-Soviet politicians. In the spring, some Leningrad residents announced they were launching what they called High-Day Park in a Mikhailov garden in the center of the city. One afternoon a week, anyone could make a public speech. The rules were anybody could speak for 5 minutes on any topic, accepting the propaganda of war, violence and xenophobia of any sort. Recalled Ivan Shoshnikov, who was a 32-year-old taxi driver at the time. and one of the masterminds behind the outdoor debating space. You want to talk about human rights? Go right ahead. One man brought the 1949 Declaration of Human Rights with him. Myself, I had already read it in some depth, but people who had never seen it before were just beside themselves, and this went on for 4 hours every Saturday, from 12 to 4. It was open mic. I should mention that this was before there was freedom of the press, so a lot of journalists could come and listen, but they could not publish what they heard. After a few months, the police kicked Hyde Park out of the Mikhail Gardens. The organizers took their show to the Kazansky Cathedral, a grand structure on Nevsky Prospect, the city's main avenue, no longer shaded by the trees or shaded by a fence. The speakers and the listeners became even more visible than they had been in the original location. Rather than chase them away again, city authorities apparently decided to drown them out with sound. One Saturday, Hyde Park participants showed up in front of the cathedral, only to discover a brass band playing in front of it. The band came complete with its own audience, whose members shouted at the debaters, "Look, the band is here so that people can relax. This is no time of praise for your speeches." During a break in the music, Ivan Sosinkov tried to chat up the conductor, who immediately volunteered that the band had been stationed in front of the cathedral by some sort of authority. Ekaterina Podoltseva, a brilliant 40-year-old mathematician who had become one of the city's most visible and most eccentric pro-democracy activists, produced a recipe for fighting the brass band. She asked all the regular Hyde Park participants to bring lemon with them the following Saturday. As soon as the band began playing, all the activists were to start eating their lemons or to imitate the process of eating if they found the rarity of it too bitter. Podoltseva had read or heard somewhere that when people see someone eating a lemon, they begin empathetically producing copious amounts of saliva, which happens to be incompatible with playing a wind instrument. It worked, the music stopped, and the speeches continued. On June 13, 1988, the Supreme Court of the USSR reversed the more than 50-year-old guilty verdict that had launched Stalin's Great Terror. The following day, a rally in memory of victims of political repression took place in Leningrad, the first such legal large-scale gatherings in the history of the Soviet Union. But the most important stories of 1988, not only in Leningrad but in all of the USSR, were the formation of an organization called the People's Front and the conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. The People's Front came into being more or less simultaneously, and it seemed spontaneously, in more than 30 cities all over the Soviet Union. Its abode goal was to support perestroika, which was battering a growing backlash within the party. But the People's Front's most important function was probably to conduct an experiment of unprecedented scope and scale in a society that had almost no experience with social change, or for that matter any other citizen activity that was not directed from the top to form an organization, even a network of organizations that was truly democratic in nature and structure. An organization that aims to democratize society must itself be democratic, proclaimed a founding document of the Leningrad organization. This is why the bylaws of the People's Front will incorporate an effective firewall against bureaucratic and authoritarian tendencies. To this end, the coordinating council shall be elected by secret board and may be reconstituted at any general meeting of the People's Front. To this end, the coordinating council does not have a permanent chairman, but all of its members shall serve as chairman by turn. To this end, no member of the People's Front shall represent the organization's position on any issue if the issue had not been discussed at a general meeting of the People's Front. It is expected that all decisions taken by the coordinating council or by the general meeting shall be recommendations. Members who are in the minority should not be obligated to participate in a decision with which they disagree, but neither shall they have the right to counteract the actions of the majority in any way other than through the power of conviction. In other words, the main purpose of the People's Front was not to be the Communist Party. Incredibly, it worked. 20 years later, a mathematician who became an activist in the late 1980s recounted discovering the People's Front. They would gather at the Food Industry Workers' House of Culture. Anyone could come. Some of those who came were not particularly mentally healthy persons. The first impression was that of a complete madhouse. Some of the speeches were totally nonsensical. This would go on for an hour or half an hour. Discussions of God knows what, and then other people would start taking the mic. I later found out they were some of the leaders of the group. In the end, when they actually took a vote on some question or another, the resulting text of the resolution would be quite reasonable. It would have a definite political component and be written in good Russian. So it turned out that the people who were leading the organization at the time were people with whom one could really discuss things. The ability to discuss things was still the most highly valued commodity in the Soviet Union. A woman quickly emerged as the evident leader and most trusted de facto spokesperson for the Leningrad's People's Front. Marina Tsareva was unlike any politician the Soviet Union had ever known. In fact, she had little in common with any politician anywhere in the world. In her 50s, unmarried, she had long lived with a woman she called her sister. She had spent much of her adult life in the farthest reaches of the Soviet Union, studying rocks. She had a PhD in geology. It was a path taken by many a member of the intelligentsia. Find a profession that is not ideologically charged and get as far as possible away from the Soviet center of command. Never having joined the Communist Party, Tsareva was not part of any institution that had been discredited. At the same time, she had impeccable St. Petersburg credentials. Her great-great-grandfather was one of the most prominent residents in the history of St. Petersburg, Paul Bohre, watchmaker to the Caesar, made timepieces that are still working and highly valued in the 21st century. Two of her great-grandfathers had come to St. Petersburg in the 19th century from France and Germany. Brilliant, well spoken in the way of those who never mince words. Tsareva elicited instant trust and a desire to follow. With a cigarette dangling from her lips, she could lead a crowd up and down Nevsky, stopping traffic. A political opponent of hers recalled 20 years later, "I saw her do it once and it made a very strong impression. No one had a chance competing with her." In February 1988, conflict erupted between Azerbaijan and Armenia, the first of what would be many ethnic conflicts in the Soviet Caucasus, in relatively wealthy, overwhelmingly Muslim Azerbaijan. A region called Nagorno-Karabakh, populated mostly by ethnic Armenians, declared its intention to secede and join Armenia, a small, poor, mostly Christian republic of the USSR. With the exception of a few visionary dissidents, no one at the time could imagine that the Soviet Empire would break apart, much less break apart soon. The events in Nagorno-Karabakh showed that the unthinkable was possible. Not only that, they showed exactly how it was going to happen. The USSR would break apart along ethnic lines, and the process would be painful and violent, but now pro-independence. Demonstrators came out into the streets of Nagorno-Karabakh in large numbers, and just days later, pogroms erupted in Samgate, an Azerbaijan city with a sizable ethnic Armenian population. More than 30 people died, hundreds more were injured. The Soviet intelligentsia watched in dismay as ethnic and religious enmities rose to the surface. In June, after Nagorno-Karabakh's regional government officially declared the region's intention to secede, more than 300 people came out into a Leningrad square to demonstrate solidarity with the Armenian people. Toward the end of the summer, Leningrad's pro-democracy activists arranged for Armenian children from Samgait to travel to summer camp outside Leningrad. A Leningrad anthropologist named Galina Starovoitova, the one whose murder I would be covering 10 years later, became the nation's most visible spokesperson for Armenian issues. On December 10, 1988, most members of the pro-Karabakh committee in Nagorno-Karabakh were placed under arrest. 2 days later, a wave of police apartment searches swept through Leningrad. The 5 pupils whose apartments were raided were all radical pro-democracy activists. They included former political prisoner Yuri Ryabakov and Ekaterina Podolseva, the mathematician who had come up with the idea of eating lemons to silence the brass band. All 5 were listed in criminal proceedings initiated under Article 70 of the Soviet Penal Code, which provided for 6 months to 7 years imprisonment for spreading anti-Soviet propaganda, more for repeat offenders. This would be the last Article 70 case in the history of the country. The transformation of Soviet society, in other words, maintained its 2 steps forward. 1 step back mode. Public rallies, which would have been unthinkable just 2 years earlier, were followed by search warrants, and the wrong kind of talk could still land one in prison for years. Censorship was lifting gradually. Boris Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago was finally published in the USSR that year, but Alexander Solzhenitsyn was still off limits. Andrei Sakharov, though now allowed to live his private life in peace, faced often insurmountable hurdles in his public life. In the summer of 1988, the dissident and Nobel Prize winner visited Leningrad. The city's best-known television journalist taped an interview with Sakharov, but the censors kept it from the air. A producer decided to sneak it into the broadcast of a pioneering late-night public affair program that was rapidly gaining popularity. She kept Sakharov's name out of the script that had to be weighted by the censors, and they readily signed off on what seemed on paper like innocuous banter. Tonight on our program you will see this, you don't say, and this. Impossible, seriously. It's the honest truth. Can it be? What the censors did not realize was that images of Sakharov would be flashing on screen as this dialogue went on, not only leaving no doubt as to what the producers planned to show, but also giving viewers enough time to call everyone they knew to tell them to turn on the television. No one was fired for fooling the censors, and this was perhaps one of the strongest indications that the changes underway in the Soviet Union were profound and possibly irreversible, and that they would transform not only the media but also the country's seemingly intransigent political institutions. On December 1, 1988, a new election law went into effect, effectively ending the Communist Party's monopoly on state power. The year 1989 began with pro-democracy activists meeting in Leningrad to organize what had seemed unthinkable just months ago, an election campaign. A committee called Election 89 formed, led by Marina Salyev, among others. It printed out flyers that explained how to vote. There will be 2, 3 or 4 names on the ballot. These are candidates who are competing with one another. You need to choose only one name and cross out the rest. It was in fact a convoluted system. 2,250 representatives were to be elected all over the Soviet Union, including 750 to be elected from territorial districts, 750 to be elected from administrative districts, and 750 to be elected by the Communist Party or institutions it controlled. Still, it was the first time voters in most areas could actually choose between two or more candidates. In Leningrad, Communist Party functionaries were trounced. Galina Soroboitova, the Leningrad's anthropologist, was elected to represent Armenia in the Supreme Soviet. She joined a minority of the newly elected representatives, about 300 of them, in forming a pro-democracy faction led by Sakharova. Once in parliament, the former dissident made it his goal to end the rule of the Communist Party, repealing the constitutional provision that guaranteed its primacy in Soviet politics. Other prominent members of the interregional group included rogue apparatchik Boris Elzin and Anatoly Sobchak, an extremely handsome and well-spoken law professor from Leningrad. During the head-spinning brief election campaign, less than 4 months passed between the passage of the revolutionary law on election and the actual vote. Sobchak had made a name for himself as an outstanding public speaker. During one of his first appearances before potential voters, sensing that the audience was tired and bored, he set aside his prepared talk on city and national issues and made a conscious decision to dazzle the listeners with oratory. "I have a dream," he actually said, "that the next election will be organized not only by the Communist Party but by voters themselves, and that these voters will be free to unite and form organizations. That campaign rallies will be open to all who want to listen, with no special passes required to enter, that any citizen will have the right to nominate himself or another person for office, and that the candidacy will not have to go through a multi-step approval process, but simply will be placed on a ballot provided there are sufficient signatures collected in support of the candidate." It was a decidedly a utopian vision. The pupil deputies, a member of the Soviet quasi-parliament, were officially called, gathered for their first Congress at the end of May 1989. The country's streets emptied out for 2 weeks. Every family sat immobile in front of a television set, watching political debate out in the open for the first time in their lives, watching history being made. The huge unwieldy gathering quickly turned into a standoff between two people: Gorbachev, the head of the state, and Sakharov, the ultimate moral authority of his time. Youthful, energetic, and now certain of his position and his popularity, Gorbachev projected confidence. Sakharov whooped, soft-spoken, prone to stumble when he talked as well as when he walked, looked out of place and ineffective. He seemed to be making his greatest mistake when, on the last day of the Congress, he took the floor and launched into a long and complicated speech. He was calling for the repeal of Article 6 of the Soviet Constitution, which granted the Communist Party rule over the Soviet state. He was speaking of the impending collapse of the empire, both the Soviet Union proper and the Eastern Bloc, and imploring the Congress to adopt a resolution on the need for reform. The huge hall was growing restless and increasingly rude. The pupils' deputies began stomping their feet and trying to shout Sakharov down. The old dissident at the microphone, straining to make himself heard, exclaimed, "I am addressing the world." Mikhail Gorbachev, sitting up on stage for a few steps from where Sakharov was trying to give his speech, looked furious both, it seemed, at the substance of the Sakharov's words and at the pandemonium that broke out in the hall in response. Suddenly, the old was went silent. Gorbachev had turned off his microphone. Sakharov gathered the pages of his talk from the lectern, took the few steps toward the Secretary General and extended his shaking hand with the sheets of paper. Gorbachev looked disgusted. "Get that away from me," he sputtered. By humiliating Sakharov on television, Gorbachev went too far. 6 months later, when the dissident died of a heart attack on the second day of the next Congress of People's Deputies, having, in the interim, seen the Berlin Wall come down and the Eastern Bloc come apart, just as he had predicted, Sakharov was widely perceived as a martyr and Gorbachev as his tormentor. Tens, possibly hundreds of thousands turned out for his funeral in Moscow. City authorities tried, habitually and ineffectively, to prevent a mass gathering by shutting down subway stations near the graveyard and posting police cordons around the perimeter. People walked for miles in the freezing cold and then proceeded coolly to break through the cordons. In Leningrad, about 20,000 people gathered for a memorial rally in the afternoon of the day Sakharov was buried. The organizers bid to hold the event in the center of the city was rejected, so the rally began in one of those vast deserted areas that crop up around socialist cities. This one was an amorphous space in front of the Lenin Concert Hall. A succession of speakers took the podium to speak about Sakharov. Despite the freezing cold, the crowd kept growing even as the brief winter sun disappeared. At dusk, the crowd made what seemed to be a spontaneous decision to march to the center of the city. Thousands of people fell into information, as though directed by an invisible hand, and began a long, difficult walk. People took turns walking in front, carrying a portrait of Sakharov and a lit candle. The entire way, Marina Salye marched behind the portrait, signifying on the one hand her willingness to follow in the great dissident's footsteps, and on the other to take responsibility for leading an illegal march. Less than 6 weeks earlier, Salye and her supporters had attended a different march, the annual November 7 celebration commemorating an anniversary of the October Revolution. Roughly 30,000 people had joined the pro-democracy contingent during that parade. The police had tried to push the pro-democracy column away from the television cameras, but once it was level with the podium on which the first secretary of the Leningrad Regional Party Committee stood, waving to the crowd, the pro-democracy contingent stopped and started chanting, "The People's Front." The People's Front marchers in the official communist contingent attempted to silence the chanters without breaking their own step. The party secretary kept smiling and waving as though nothing out of the ordinary were going on. It was his last time up on the podium, greeting a November 7 crowd. On November 7, the pro-democracy marchers had confronted the orderly, officially sanctioned communist marches. Now they were simply claiming the city as their own. The march would take several hours. The crowd would overcome police efforts to break it up. They would stop to hold rallies at several symbolic locations. Along their route, candles would appear in their hands. Thousands more would join them as they walked. For Salye, 55 and overweight, 55 and overweight, the march was grueling exercise. She had come out that day wearing a heavy fur coat that was a bit too small, so she marched with it open in front, feeling exposed and inappropriate. At one point she slipped and fell, and though she did not hurt herself, she felt ashamed. Over the many hours of the march, she kept getting news from the back of the column that the police were once again trying to break up the procession. The following day, Salye recalled many years later, "We were at my house working on the People's Front platform because we were planning a congress. When a police colonel showed up to serve me a warrant for organizing an illegal march. He was amazing. The policeman, he said, 'You know, I could have come and not found you at home.' He was lovely, but I said, 'No, go right ahead.' And I accepted the warrant, and we started calling lawyers and the media. The next morning, I reported to the police station. They kept trying to get me to say who had organized the march. I kept saying, how should I know? I don't remember. There were so many people there. In fact, one of the Sarri's People's Front comrades had been the mastermind behind the march. They kept demanding an answer. She continued. A telegram was delivered while I was there. Some well-known democratic leaders from Moscow were speaking up in my defense. Then I was told I had taken to court. I grabbed onto the desk with my bare hands as hard as I could and said, you will have to carry me to court. I am not going anywhere until my lawyer gets here. I spent all day there at the police station. They kept making phone calls, trying to get instructions on what to do with me. In the end, they took away all documents, took me to a room with barred windows and locked me there. And then it was all over and I was allowed to leave the station to the joyous screams of my friends who had gathered there. The following day, Leningrad newspapers came out with front-page headlines, readings, arrested for mourning Sakharov, and Marina Sarri, already one of the most popular pupils in the city, became its indisputable political leader. In 2 months, Leningrad would hold a city council election and Sarri would sail in. Years later, she claimed she had no intention of running for office. She had planned to coordinate the campaign for the People's Front candidates without running herself. But after her arrest for the Sakharov Memorial March, she needed immunity from prosecution. This would be the first elected city council in Leningrad history, and really, the first popularly elected governing body in the Soviet Union. Like all cities, Leningrad had been run by the local chapter of the Communist Party. New politicians and new rules proposed to relegate the Communist Party to the status of, well, a political party and to rule the city through representative democracy. The transition was fast, painful, and sometimes hilarious. In the March election, pro-democracy candidates trounced the Communist Party, taking about two-thirds of the 400 seats. 120 seats went to the People's Front. Following the vote, an organizing committee of 60 deputies convened to discuss the future working of the city council. Leningrad's party boss, Boris Gidaspov, invited the committee to see him at the Smolny Institute, a historic college building that housed the regional party headquarters. The deputies politely suggested Gidaspov come see them himself at the Mariinsky Palace, the grand building facing St. Isaac's Square, where the old communist-run city council had held its sessions, where the activists of the Battle of the Angry Terry had gone to try to negotiate with city officials, and where the new Democratic Council would be housed. Gidaspov, the old guard personified, had spent his entire professional life in Leningrad's military-industrial complex, rising through the ranks fast and running vast institutes before being appointed to run the city party organization. In 1989, he walked into the conference room in the Mariinsky and headed straight for the head of the table. No sooner had he sat down than one of the deputies said, "That is not your seat." This was the changing of the guard. A similarly symbolic scene took place in the Mariinsky's main hall days later, when the new city council convened for its first session. The 400 newly elected deputies took their seats in a grand amphitheater, looking down on a small walnut desk at which two men were already seated. Both were old-time party bureaucrats, cast in the same mold as Gidaspov, heavy-set, square-shouldered, grey-suited, with layered faces that never looked clean-shaven. One of them rose and began reading a standard speech which opened with words of congratulations to the deputies on their election. One of those being congratulated approached the desk to ask, "Who told you were running the meeting?" The bureaucrat trailed off, confused, and Alexei Kovalev, the preservationist known as The hero of the Battle of the Anglitere appeared at the front of hall and suggested the two visitors stop getting in the way of the session. The man got up, and Kova, Lev, and Sally took the two seats at the desk in order to run the first meeting of the first democratically elected governing body in the Soviet Union. The session began as planned by the coordinating committee, with three of its members making procedural announcements. When they came to the front, the hall erupted with laughter because all three sported the standard issue intelligentsia look, turtleneck, sweaters, and beards. It was fantastical, recalled a sociologist who was present at the session. It was a total change of atmosphere. The shoots with their mugs were out and the informal were in, keeping with what one of them later termed an acute sense of democracy that brought them to the Mariinsky. The new deputies, in one of their first rulings, decided to remove all guards from the palace so that any citizen could gain access to any office or meeting hall. The Mariinsky took on the look of a railroad station during the Russian Civil War. One of the city council members wrote later, dozens of homeless men would stand at the entrance to the main assembly hall, grabbing deputies and trying to push typed papers into their hands. I remember a bearded man who kept trying to get the deputies to consider some brilliant inventions of his. We had voted to remove the guards from the palace, and it was literally the next day that we were forced to calculate the cost of bronze details of the building's interior that had gone missing. The guard was soon re-established, but the people kept coming. People so longed to be heard. Another city council member recalled later, when voters came to see us, we felt somewhat like reached administering confession. We would say, I cannot provide you with a new apartment that would extend beyond the scope of my authority. And they would respond, just hear me out. And we would listen, attentively and patiently. And people would leave satisfied. The realization that voters expected not only to be heard, but also to be protected and fed would come a few months later. In accordance with the principles of radical democracy, the city council had no formal leader. This, however, proved impractical and even impolitic, as members of the new city council struggled to invent parliamentary procedure more or less from scratch, testing and reasserting rules of order in real time and often on the air of the local television channel. Leningrad voters began to grow impatient. The city, the country, and life itself seemed to be falling apart all around them, while the Democrats practiced democracy without getting anything done. Marina Sally, still the city's most popular politician, decided not to run for chairman of the council. 20 years later, she was hard-pressed to explain that decision. I wish someone could tell me the answer, she said. Was it my stupidity, my inexperience, my shyness, or my naivety? I don't know, but the fact is I did not do it, and it was a mistake. With Sally's recusing herself, city council activists decided to reach out to one of the city's other two perestroika heroes, Anatoly Sobchak, the law professor who had earned a reputation in Moscow as the Democrat from Leningrad. Sobchak was different from the bearded, sweater-bearing informers. In contrast to their contemplative, usually unassuming air, he was an ostensibly sharp dresser. The communists liked to criticize him for his bourgeois outfits and his trademark checkered blazer. Still comes up in political reminiscence over 20 years later, and a forceful speaker. He seemed to love the sound of his own voice, as one of his former colleagues recalled. Sobchak could derail a working meeting by delivering an impromptu 40-minute speech on the benefit of building an imaginary bridge and mesmerize listeners while saying nothing of substance. Though Sobchak belonged to Sakharov's inter-regional group in the Supreme Soviet, he was actually far more conservative than the informers who were calling him back to Leningrad. a law professor who had taught at the police academy. He was in many ways part of the outgoing Soviet establishment. He had recently joined the Communist Party, clearly believing that with all of Gorbachev's reform, the party would continue to run the country, and in a divided city whose new democratic politicians were increasingly using its historic designation, St. Petersburg, he opposed changing the name of the city, arguing that the name Leningrad better reflected its military value. Sobchak was also much more of a politician than any of the informal knew now to be. He had far-reaching ambition. It would not be long before he started telling everyone he would be the next president of Russia. Meanwhile, at the city level, he apparently wanted to preside over the entire city council without being beholden to the Democrats who had called him to the throne. To that end, he did some advanced and highly secretive lobbying among the minority Communist Party faction of the council, and the communists surprised everyone by voting in favor of Sobchak. A few minutes later, Sobchak in turn upset expectations by not nominating Sal A or one of other prominent Democrats to be his deputy. Instead, he named Vyacheslav Sachevakov, a Communist Party member and a rare admirer. The Democrats, taken aback, nonetheless honored their agreement with Sobchak and voted to confirm Sachevakov as his deputy. Sobchak then addressed the city council. He spelled out how he saw his mission. He was there to be the boss, not the leader. He viewed the city council as being bogged down in democratic procedure for the sake of democratic procedure, as he put it, and he wanted to get on with the business of actually running the city. His voice growing more confident with every passing minute. Sobchak informed the city council that things were about to change. We realized our mistake as soon as we had voted for him, recalled one of the city council members. Later, Sobchak was intent on destroying what a majority of city council members saw as the greatest accomplishment of the 2 months that had passed since their own election, the invention of a non-Soviet way of doing business. The informers went home shocked and dejected. Sobchak went to the airport to fly to a legal conference in the United States. His St. Petersburg period was murkiest. Gevorkian said of the campaign biography, she and her colleagues wrote, "I never did figure out how he hooked up with Sobchak." Back in Leningrad, Putin's KGB colleagues seemed to be seeking ways not to fight the new political reality but to adapt to it. And initially, it seemed that this was what Putin would have to do as well, rather than leave the KGB in a huff, stay with it in a sulk and look around for new friends, new mentors, and perhaps new ways of wielding influence from the shadows. The saying, "Once a spy, always a spy," was factually correct. The KGB never let its officers off the leash. But where did all those used as up spies go? The KGB actually had a name and a structure of sorts for its broad, active reserve. These were the nearly uncountable and possibly uncounted numbers of KGB officers planted throughout the civilian institution of the USSR. Just over a year later, when a liberal Gorbachev appointee named Vadim Bagatin took over the KGB with the goal of dismantling the institution, it was the active reserve that he found most puzzling and intractable. These were officers of the KGB who were officially employed by all state and civic organizations of any significance. He wrote most often, many if not all staff within the organization were aware that these people worked for the KGB. Active reserve officers performed a variety of functions. Some of them managed the system of security clearances, while others concentrated on monitoring the moods and conversations within the organization and taking what they considered to be appropriate actions in regard to any dissidents. Certainly, there exist situations when a secret police organization needs to have a person planted within some organization or another. But one would expect this kind of arrangement to be secret. What kind of a secret service has a staff that everyone can identify? Bakatin answered his own question. The KGB as it existed could not be termed a secret service. It was an organization formed to control and suppress everything and anything. It seemed to be created especially for organizing conspiracies and coups, as it possessed everything necessary to carry them out: its own specially trained armed forces, the capacity to track and control communications, its own people inside all essential organizations, a monopoly on information, and many other things. It was a monster that had its tentacles everywhere in Soviet society. Vladimir Putin decided to take his place at the end of one of those tentacles. Putin told his friend, the essayist, that he was thinking of moving to Moscow to join the vast KGB bureaucracy in the capital. But then he decided to stay in Leningrad, and perhaps because he was always drawn to the familiar, turned to the only institution outside the KGB with which he had ever been linked: Leningrad State University. Putin's new job title was Assistant Chancellor for Foreign Relations. Like all organizations in the USSR, Leningrad State University was just beginning to recognize that the possibility of foreign relations existed. Its instructors and graduate students were starting to travel abroad to study and take part in conferences. They still had to overcome major bureaucratic hurdles, but the option of foreign travel, which had been reserved for a very select few, was now accessible to many. Students and instructors were also starting to come in from abroad, once again an option that had been open only to students from socialist bloc countries and a few hand-picked graduate students from the West was now accessible to pretty much anyone. Like thousands of other Soviet organizations, Leningrad State University saw its state funding drastically cut and hoped that foreign relations, whatever form they might take, would bring in much needed hard currency. It was a perfect job for a member of the active reserve. Not only had such postings been traditionally reserved for KGB appointees, but everyone generally believed they really were better than anyone else at seeking and sewing up relations with foreigners. They were, after all, the only ones with experience. Putin has said he planned to start writing a dissertation and perhaps stay at the university indefinitely. But in fact, like so many other things in the Soviet Union at the time, this job had an air of transition about it. He stayed at Leningrad State University less than 3 months. The story of how Putin came to work for Anatoly Sobchak during his tenure as chairman of the Leningrad City Council is well known, often recounted, and most certainly untrue in many or all of its best publicized details. In the apocryphal version, Sobchak, the law professor and celebrity politician, was walking down the hall at the university, saw Putin and asked him to come to work for him at the city council. In Putin's own version, a former classmate at the law faculty arranged a meeting in Sobchak's office. In Putin's version, he had attended Sobchak's lectures at the law faculty in the 1970s but had no personal relationship with him. I remember the scene well. Putin told his biographers. I entered, introduced myself and told him everything. He was an impulsive person, so he immediately said, I will speak with the chancellor. You start work on Monday. That's it. I will make all the arrangements and you will be transferred. In the Soviet system of job assignments, office workers were indeed often transferred like serfs by agreement of their owners. I could not say, Anatoly Alexandrovich, it would be my pleasure to come to work for you. I am interested. I even want the job, but there is a fact that will probably be an obstacle to this transfer. He asked, what's that? I say, I have to tell you that I am not just an assistant to the chancellor. I am a staff officer at the KGB. He got to thinking, since this was a truly unexpected turn for him. He thought for a bit and then said, well, screw it. The dialogue is certainly fiction, and mediocre fiction at that. Why does Putin claim to have told him everything if he did not tell Sobchak about his KGB affiliation until after Sobchak extended the job offer? Why does Putin make Sobchak out to be both an ignorant fool? Everyone at Leningrad State University knew Putin was a KGB officer and a Bulgarian. Probably because this was not a well-rehearsed lie when he told it to his biographers, whom he had likely expected to sidestep the delicate and too obvious question of how a career KGB officer came to work for once Russia's most prominent pro-democracy politicians. Sobchak himself told a different fiction. Putin was most certainly not assigned to me by the KGB, he said in a newspaper interview, the same week that Putin was speaking to his own biographers, and this explains the discrepancy. I found Putin myself and asked him to come and work for me because I had known him before. I remembered him very well as a student for his work at the law faculty. Why did he become my deputy? I ran into him entirely by accident in the hallway of the university. I recognized him, said hello, and started asking him what he had been up to. It turned out he had worked in Germany for a long time and was now working as an assistant to the chancellor. He had been a very good student, though he has this trait. He does not like to stand out. In this sense, he is a person devoid of vanity, of any external ambition. But inside, he is a leader. Anatoly Sobchak certainly knew that Putin was a KGB officer. Moreover, that is exactly why he sought him out. This was the sort of politician Sobchak was. He talked a colorful pro-democracy line, but he liked to have a solid conservative base from which to do it. This was also why he chose a communist and a rare admiral and to be his deputy on the city council. Not only did Sobchak feel more secure surrounded by men who had emerged from various armed services, he felt much more comfortable with these men than with the over-educated, excessively talkative, process-oriented, pro-democracy activists like Sergei and her ilk. He had taught law at the police academy in Leningrad. He had taught men who were just like what he perceived Putin to be, dependable but not brilliant, not outwardly ambitious, and ever mindful of the chain of command. In addition, he needed Putin for the exact same reason the university had needed him. He was one of the very few people in the city who had ever worked abroad, and the city needed foreign help and foreign money. Finally, Sobchak, who had risen through the top ranks, both at the university where he was now a full professor and in the Communist Party, knew that it was wiser to pick your KGB handler yourself than to have one picked for you. Whether Sobchak was right in believing he was picking his own handler, however, is an open question. A former colleague of Putin's in East Germany told me that in February 1990, Putin had a meeting with Major General Yuri Drozdov, head of the KGB Illegal Intelligence Directorate, when the Major General visited Berlin. The only possible purpose of the meeting could have been giving Putin his next assignment. Sergei Buzhukov, who defected to Germany in 1991, told me, why else would the head of the directorate be meeting with an agent who was scheduled to be going home? That sort of thing just did not happen. Buzhukov and other officers wondered what Putin's new job would be and what made it important enough for the top brass to be involved. When Putin went to work for Sobchak, Buzhukov believed he had his answer. His old friend had been called back in order to infiltrate the inner circle of one of the country's leading pro-democracy politicians. The university job had been a stepping stone. Putin informed the Leningrad's KGB that he was about to change jobs. I told them I have received an offer from Anatoly I have received an offer to transfer from the university and work for him. If this is impossible, I am willing to resign. They responded, no, why should you? Go work at the new job, no problem. The dialogue seems to be another absurd fiction. Even in the very unlikely event that he had not been steered to Sobchak by the KGB itself, Putin would have had no reason to suspect that the opportunity to plant him alongside the city's most prominent Democrat would be greeted with anything but enthusiasm in the KGB. By this time, the New Democrats had become the KGB's main focus. The previous year, Gorbachev had created the Committee for Constitutional Oversight, a law enforcement body intended to bring Soviet governing practices in line with the country's own constitution. In 1990, the committee began its fight against covert KGB operations, banning any actions based on secret internal instructions, and the KGB ignored it. Instead, it conducted around-the-clock surveillance of Boris Yeltsin and other prominent Democrats. It taped their phones, including ones in hotel rooms they rented. It also taped the phones of their friends, relatives, hairdressers, and sports coaches. So it is extremely unlikely that Putin told his biographer the truth when he claimed not to report to the KGB on his work with Sobchak, all the while drawing a larger salary from the secret police than he did at the city council. How, if, and when Putin finally severed his connection with the KGB is astounding, not a matter of public record, but not even the subject of coherent myth-making. Putin has said that within a few months after he came to work for Sobchak, a member of the city council began blackmailing him, threatening to expose him as a KGB officer. Putin realized he had to leave. It was a very difficult decision. It had been nearly a year since I de facto stopped working for the security service, but my entire life still revolved around it. It was 1990. The USSR had not yet fallen apart. The August coup had not yet happened, so there was no final clarity as to which way the country would go. Sobchak was certainly an outstanding person and prominent politician, but it seemed risky to tie my own career to his. Everything could have been reversed in a minute, and I could not imagine what I would do if I lost my job at City Hall. I was thinking I might go back to the university, write a dissertation, and take odd jobs. I had a stable position with the KGB, and I was treated well. I was successful within the system, yet I decided to leave. Why? What for? I was literally suffering. I had to make the most difficult decision in my life. I thought for a long time, trying to collect my thoughts, then gathered myself together, sat down, and wrote the resignation letter on my first attempt without writing a draft. This monologue, pronounced 10 years later, is in fact a remarkable document. If Putin did leave the most feared and frightening organization in the Soviet Union, he never, not ever, even retrospectively framed his decision in ideological, political, or moral terms. 10 years later, as he prepared to lead a new Russia, he readily admitted that he had been willing to serve my master. Most of all, he would have liked to haze his bets and serve them all. His bets he did. The KGB lost his letter of resignation, and whether by clever arrangement or by virtue of being an organization chronically incapable of managing its own paperwork. Either way, Vladimir Putin was still an officer of the KGB in August 1991, when the KGB finally undertook the state coup for which it seemed to have been designed.